Lena Carter's hands trembled as she stared at the impossible photograph tucked inside a stranger's wallet. The image showed her 7-year-old self, smiling in a backyard that no longer existed, wearing a dress she'd forgotten she owned. But it wasn't the memory that made her blood run cold. It was the date stamped on the back, taken exactly 3 weeks before her parents died in what police called an unfortunate accident. This man, this sharply dressed stranger she'd never met, had been watching her since childhood. And if he had this photo, he knew the truth about the night that destroyed her life. Some accidents aren't accidents at all. They're executions dressed as misfortune. If you want to discover the deadly truth hidden in Lena's past, stay until the end of this story. Drop a like and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The flash of Lena Carter's camera captured the exact moment the diamond necklace caught the light, throwing prismatic sparkles across the throat of Manhattan's newest philanthropist. Through her viewfinder, everything looked perfect. The elegant curve of the woman's smile, the champagne flutes raised in celebration, the glittering gala that filled the Metropolitan Club's grand ballroom with the kind of wealth that could buy anything except authenticity. Lena lowered her camera and allowed herself a small breath of satisfaction. 3 years of building her freelance photography business, and she'd finally landed a contract with one of the city's premier event planning companies. Tonight's charity gala was her chance to prove she belonged in this world of designer gowns and 7-figure donations, even if she was only here to document it. "Excuse me, miss? Would you mind taking a photo of our group?" Lena turned to find an older woman extending her phone with the confidence of someone accustomed to being accommodated. Of course. She spent the next 20 minutes doing exactly what she'd been hired for, capturing moments of carefully curated generosity, freezing smiles that would later be posted on social media with captions about giving back. Her feet ached in the heels she'd borrowed from her roommate, and her shoulders burned from the weight of her camera equipment. But Lena had learned long ago that survival in New York meant pushing through discomfort with grace. By 11 o'clock, the crowd had thinned considerably. Lena packed her gear with practiced efficiency, her mind already calculating whether she'd made enough from this gig to cover next month's rent and still have money left for groceries. The math was depressing, as always. The parking garage beneath the venue was a stark contrast to the opulence upstairs. All concrete and fluorescent lighting, expensive cars sitting in numbered spaces like metallic trophies. Lena's beat-up Honda waited in the furthest corner, exactly where vehicles belonging to hired help were expected to park. She was halfway to her car when she noticed the wallet. It lay on the concrete near a sleek black Mercedes, the leather so fine it seemed to glow even under the harsh lights. Lena glanced around, but the garage was empty except for the distant echo of footsteps from the stairwell. Someone had probably dropped it while getting into their car, too distracted by champagne and conversation to notice. The responsible thing would be to turn it in to security, but something made Lena pick it up instead, the leather warm and supple in her hands. She told herself she was just checking for identification, for a way to return it to its owner. That's what good people did. The wallet was expensive. Italian leather, she guessed, the kind that cost more than her monthly rent. She opened it carefully, expecting to find credit cards and a driver's license, maybe some cash. What she found instead made her forget how to breathe. The photograph was old, its edges slightly faded, the colors holding that particular quality of images from the early 2000s. It showed a little girl, maybe 7 years old, sitting on a swing in a backyard. The girl wore a yellow sundress with white flowers, her dark hair pulled into pigtails, her smile bright and unself-conscious. She was mid-swing, frozen in that perfect moment of childhood joy when the whole world felt safe and possible. Lena knew that dress. She remembered the way it had twirled when she spun in circles, how her mother had sewn a small tear in the hem after she'd caught it on a fence. She remembered that swing set, the squeak of the chains, the way the afternoon sun felt warm on her shoulders. She remembered that day. With shaking hands, Lena turned the photo over. Written in faded blue ink was a date, July 15th, 2005. 3 weeks before her parents died. The garage seemed to tilt around her. Lena grabbed the Mercedes for support, her camera bag sliding from her shoulder and hitting the concrete with a thud that echoed through the empty space. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was holding, trying to find any rational explanation for why a complete stranger would have a photograph of her childhood. She'd never seen this photo before. After her parents died, she'd gone to live with her aunt in Queens, and most of their belongings had been sold or donated. The few photos that survived were now in a shoebox under her bed. School pictures, a handful of holiday snapshots, nothing like this candid moment captured in her own backyard. Lena forced herself to look through the rest of the wallet with trembling fingers. The driver's license identified the owner as Marco Valenti, age 38, with an address in Tribeca that suggested the kind of wealth she'd been photographing all evening. His photo showed a man with dark hair, sharp features, and eyes that seemed to assess the camera with cool calculation. She'd never seen him before in her life. But somehow, he'd been watching her since she was 7 years old. The parking garage suddenly felt dangerous. Lena shoved the wallet into her camera bag and practically ran to her Honda, her heels clicking frantically against the concrete. She fumbled with her keys, dropped them, grabbed them again, finally getting the door unlocked. Once inside with the doors locked, she sat in the driver's seat and tried to control her breathing. Think, she told herself. Think rationally. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the photo had gotten mixed up with someone else's belongings. Maybe Marco Valenti had bought the wallet secondhand and never noticed the photo inside. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation. But Lena had learned a long time ago that innocent explanations were usually just comfortable lies people told themselves to avoid facing uncomfortable truths. She pulled out her phone and typed Marco Valenti's name into the search bar. The results were sparse. A few mentions in business articles, a photograph from a charity event 3 years ago, nothing that suggested anything unusual. He appeared to be exactly what his expensive wallet implied, a successful businessman who moved in circles far above her own. Nothing that explained why he had her photograph. Lena started her car and drove home in a daze, barely registering the familiar route through Manhattan's late-night streets. Her apartment in the East Village was a fourth-floor walk-up she shared with her best friend Riley, a struggling actress who waited tables and went to auditions with the same relentless optimism that Lena had once possessed, before life taught her that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. The lights were off when she let herself in, which meant Riley was either asleep or at her boyfriend's place. Lena was grateful for the solitude. She dropped her camera bag on the worn couch and pulled out the wallet, staring at it as if it might transform into something less threatening. It didn't. She made herself tea she didn't drink and sat at their small kitchen table, the photograph laid out in front of her like evidence at a crime scene. In the harsh overhead light, she could see more details. The way her mother's garden had been visible in the background, the specific pattern of clouds in the summer sky, the shadow of whoever had taken the photo stretching across the grass. Someone had been in her yard. Someone had photographed her without her knowledge or her parents' permission, and that someone had kept the photo for 19 years. The thought made her skin crawl. Lena's parents had died in a car accident on August 7th, 2005. She'd been staying overnight at a friend's house when it happened, a rare treat that had probably saved her life. The police said her father had lost control on a wet road, that the car had hit a tree at a speed that made survival impossible. It was tragic, but straightforward. An accident. She'd never questioned it. She'd been 7 years old, drowning in grief, shuttled off to live with an aunt who loved her but didn't quite know what to do with a traumatized child. The details of her parents' death had become something she didn't examine too closely, a wound she'd learned to work around rather than probe. But now, staring at this photograph, Lena felt 19 years of accepted truth beginning to crack. Why would someone photograph her 3 weeks before her parents died? Why keep that photo? Why carry it in a wallet nearly 2 decades later? Unless the accident wasn't an accident at all. The thought was so enormous, so impossible, that Lena's mind tried to reject it immediately. People didn't murder suburban couples with a 7-year-old daughter. Her parents had been ordinary, her father an accountant, her mother a part-time teacher. They'd lived a quiet life in a modest house in Westchester. There'd been nothing remarkable about them, nothing that would make them targets. Except something had made them targets, something she didn't know about, couldn't remember, had never thought to question. Lena grabbed her laptop and started searching, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She found the newspaper article about the accident easily enough. It was brief, barely more than a few paragraphs. David and Susan Carter killed when their vehicle left the road during a rainstorm. Survived by their daughter. Services private. The article included no details about the investigation, no quotes from police, nothing that suggested anyone had looked beyond the obvious conclusion. She searched for Marco Valenti again, going deeper this time, scrolling past the surface results to find anything that might explain the connection. An hour later, she'd found almost nothing. A few more business mentions, a property record for his Tribeca address, a notation that he served on the board of a children's hospital. Nothing that suggested he was anything other than what he appeared to be. And nothing that explained the photograph. By 3 in the morning, Lena's tea had gone cold, and her eyes burned from staring at the laptop screen. She knew she should sleep, should wait until morning to decide what to do. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw that photograph, her 7-year-old self, smiling and innocent, unaware that in 3 weeks her entire world would shatter, unaware that someone was watching. She was still sitting at the kitchen table when Riley came home just after dawn, smelling like her boyfriend's cologne and carrying her shoes in one hand. "Lena, what are you doing up?" Riley stopped in the doorway, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Are you okay? You look terrible." Lena realized she was still wearing the dress from the gala, her borrowed heels kicked off somewhere near the door, her makeup smeared from rubbing her eyes. She must look exactly like what she was, someone who'd been awake all night confronting impossible questions. "I found something last night," Lena said, her voice rough from disuse. "At the gala. Someone dropped their wallet, and when I opened it to find ID, I found this." She held up the photograph. Riley moved closer, squinting at the image. "Is that you? God, you were cute. Where'd you find this?" "In a stranger's wallet, a man I've never met. This photo was taken 3 weeks before my parents died, Riley." 3 weeks. The implications hung in the air between them. Riley was many things. Optimistic to a fault, occasionally flaky, prone to dramatic interpretations. But she wasn't stupid. Lena watched understanding dawn across her friend's face. "Okay," Riley said slowly. She pulled out a chair and sat down, her earlier good mood evaporating. "Okay, that's really weird. Have you called the police?" "And tell them what? That I found an old photo? They'd probably think I stole the wallet." "So what are you going to do?" It was the question Lena had been asking herself all night. The smart thing would be to throw the wallet away, forget she'd ever seen the photograph, go back to her normal life of struggling to pay rent and booking photography gigs. The smart thing would be to leave the past buried. But Lena had spent 19 years not asking questions, accepting the story she'd been told about her parents' death, building a life on a foundation that might be built on lies. And now she held proof that someone had been watching her, had been part of her story in ways she'd never known. She couldn't unknow that. She couldn't unsee the photograph. "I'm going to find him," Lena said. "Marco Valenti. I'm going to find him and ask him why he has this photo." Riley's eyes widened. "Lena, that's insane. What if he's dangerous? What if there's a reason you've never heard of him?" "Then I need to know what that reason is." "This is how people end up on true crime podcasts," Riley said, but her voice held resignation rather than real protest. She knew Lena well enough to recognize when her friend had made a decision. "At least let me come with you. Safety in numbers and all that." Lena shook her head. "If this goes wrong, I don't want you involved. But I need you to do something for me. If I text you a specific phrase, let's say, the gallery opening was amazing, I need you to call the police immediately and tell them where I am." "Jesus, Lena." "Promise me." Riley grabbed Lena's hand across the table, squeezing hard. "Promise." "But you're being paranoid, right? This is just precaution?" "I hope so," Lena said. She didn't add that hope and reality rarely aligned, that she'd learned that lesson on a rainy night in August when she was 7 years old. She spent the day trying to function normally, uploading photos from the gala, responding to emails, pretending her world hadn't shifted on its axis. But her mind kept returning to the photograph, to the questions that multiplied with each passing hour. By early evening, Lena had made her decision. She dressed carefully in jeans and a simple sweater, nothing that suggested she was trying to impress or intimidate. She tucked the wallet into her messenger bag, along with her phone, keys, and a canister of pepper spray Riley insisted she take. The address on Marco Valenti's license led to a restored brownstone in Tribeca, the kind of building that whispered old money and new power. Lena stood on the sidewalk across the street, studying the elegant facade, the wrought iron details, the warm light glowing behind tall windows. It looked like the kind of place where nothing bad had ever happened, where life moved according to rules she didn't understand. She almost turned around 3 times, but then she thought of her parents, of the life they'd never gotten to live, of all the years she'd accepted a story that might not be true. She thought of her 7-year-old self, frozen in that photograph, unaware of the future waiting to crash down on her. Lena crossed the street and climbed the stairs to the front door. There was no doorbell, just a heavy brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. She used it twice, the sound echoing with a finality that made her heart race. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened. The man who stood in the doorway matched his driver's license photo, but the picture hadn't captured the full force of his presence. Marco Valenti was tall, easily 6'2", with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes that assessed her with the kind of sharp intelligence that missed nothing. He wore a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark slacks, no shoes, the casual appearance of someone comfortable in his own domain. Those eyes fixed on her face, and Lena watched something flicker across his expression. Recognition, maybe, or surprise. "Can I help you?" His voice was deep, controlled, with the faint trace of an accent that suggested he'd grown up speaking another language before English. Lena pulled the wallet from her bag and held it out. "You dropped this last night, at the gala." Marco's gaze moved to the wallet, then back to her face. He didn't take it. "I see. And you thought you'd return it personally rather than leave it with security?" "I thought we should talk." "About what?" Lena pulled out the photograph. Her hand was steady, even though her pulse hammered in her throat. "About why you've been carrying around a picture of me since I was 7 years old." The silence that followed was absolute. Marco's expression didn't change, not a flicker of surprise or guilt or confusion. He simply stood there, studying her with those calculating eyes, weighing options she couldn't see. Finally, he stepped back from the door. "You should come inside." Every instinct Lena possessed screamed at her to run. She was standing at the threshold of a stranger's home, a stranger who had inexplicably possessed her childhood photograph for 19 years. This was how people disappeared, how bodies ended up in rivers, how headlines began. But she'd come this far, and running now wouldn't change the questions that would haunt her forever. Lena stepped inside. The interior of the brownstone matched its exterior, elegant, expensive, carefully curated. Hardwood floors gleamed under soft lighting. Artwork that might have been original hung on walls painted in shades of cream and gray. It was the home of someone who understood that true wealth didn't need to announce itself. Marco led her to a study lined with bookshelves, a massive desk dominating one end of the room. He gestured to a leather chair positioned across from the desk. "Please sit." Lena sat, mostly because her legs felt suddenly unsteady. Marco closed the study door and moved to a small bar cart, pouring amber liquid into 2 crystal glasses. He offered one to her. "I don't drink with strangers," Lena said. "Smart." Marco set both glasses on the desk and took his own seat, his posture relaxed, but his eyes never leaving her face. "You look like her. Your mother. Same eyes, same stubborn chin." The casual mention of her mother made Lena's breath catch. "You knew my parents." "No, but my brother did." The answer opened more questions than it closed. Lena gripped the arms of the chair, forcing herself to stay calm, to think like the photographer she was, observing details, reading the space between words. "Your brother?" "Antonio. He died 20 years ago this February." Marco picked up one of the glasses and took a slow sip, giving Lena time to process. "He was investigating a criminal operation. Your parents were connected to it, though probably not in the way you're imagining." Lena's world tilted. "My parents were accountants and teachers. They weren't criminals." "No, they weren't. But they witnessed something they shouldn't have, and Antonio was trying to protect them." Marco set down his glass with careful precision. "He failed. So did I." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Lena wasn't ready to examine. She thought of her father's smile, her mother's laugh, the ordinary suburban life that had seemed so safe and normal. She thought of the rainy night that shattered everything, the story of an accident she'd never questioned. "The car crash," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't an accident. No, Marco confirmed, and with that single word, 19 years of accepted truth crumbled into dust. It was an execution designed to look like misfortune. Your parents were murdered, Miss Carter, and the people responsible made sure it looked like nothing more than a tragedy. Lena stood abruptly, the chair scraping against hardwood. She moved to the window, staring out at the Tribeca street below without really seeing it. Her hands shook, her breath came in shallow gasps. Some distant part of her mind recognized she was having a panic attack, but the knowledge didn't help her control it. Behind her, she heard Marco stand, heard his footsteps approach. He didn't touch her, didn't crowd her space, just stood close enough that she could feel his presence. "Breathe," he said quietly. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Focus on the count. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. Lena followed his instructions automatically, the steady rhythm of his voice anchoring her to the present moment. Slowly, the panic receded, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion and a rage so pure it felt like clarity. She turned to face him. "Tell me everything, every single detail. I want to know who killed my parents and why. I want to know why you have that photograph. I want to know why you never contacted me, never told me the truth." Marco studied her for a long moment, and Lena had the unsettling feeling he was measuring something in her, weighing whether she could handle what he was about to reveal. Finally, he nodded. "Your father worked as an accountant for various small businesses throughout Westchester. One of those businesses was a front for money laundering, specifically for a criminal organization moving drug money through legitimate channels. Your father discovered the discrepancies about 6 months before he died. Instead of ignoring it, he kept records. He was building evidence to take to the authorities." The image of her father shifted in Lena's mind. She'd always remembered him as quiet, methodical, someone who did crossword puzzles on Sunday mornings and helped her with math homework. She'd never imagined him as brave, as someone who would risk everything for what was right. "My brother Antonio was—" Marco paused, choosing his words carefully. "He worked in a similar world, but on the opposite side. He'd been trying to dismantle the organization your father had discovered. When he learned about your father's evidence, he made contact. He was supposed to protect your family while building a case." "But he didn't," Lena said flatly. "He underestimated how quickly the organization would act, and Marco's jaw tightened. "I was too young, too ambitious, too focused on building my own empire to listen when Antonio told me he needed help. By the time I understood the danger, it was too late." "The photograph," Lena said. "Why did he have it? Why did you keep it?" Marco walked back to his desk and pulled out a folder from a locked drawer. He opened it carefully, revealing several documents and photographs. Among them, Lena recognized the photo from the wallet. "Antonio took this 3 weeks before your parents died. He'd been watching your house, documenting movements, trying to identify threats. This particular day, he noted that someone else had been watching too. A car parked down the street with darkened windows, present for several hours. He suspected they were already being targeted." Lena's stomach turned as she imagined that summer day from a new perspective. She'd been on the swing, innocent and happy, while multiple strangers watched from the shadows, calculating violence. "After your parents were killed, after Antonio died trying to stop it, I kept the photo as a reminder." Marco's voice was rough. "A reminder of what happens when you fail to protect people who deserve protection. I've carried it for 19 years. Your brother died trying to save my parents?" "He died because the organization discovered he was helping them. They made it look like a gang dispute, wrong place, wrong time. But Antonio knew exactly where he was and exactly what he was risking." Marco met her eyes. He chose to try anyway. The weight of these revelations pressed down on Lena's chest. Her entire understanding of her past was reshaping itself, revealing a landscape of violence and sacrifice she'd never imagined. Her parents hadn't been random victims of a rainy road. They'd been brave and foolish and human, making choices that cost them everything. And she'd been 7 years old, playing on a swing, completely unaware. "Why didn't you tell me?" Lena demanded. "After I grew up, why didn't you find me and explain what really happened?" "Because knowing the truth would have made you a target," Marco said bluntly. "The organization that killed your parents still exists. If they knew you were asking questions, investigating what happened, they would eliminate that threat. I kept watch from a distance, made sure you were safe, but I couldn't risk direct contact. You kept watch? Lena's voice rose. What does that mean? Have you been following me? Ensuring your safety isn't the same as stalking, Miss Carter. I made certain you weren't in danger, that the people responsible for your parents' death didn't discover you were anything more than a tragic orphan who'd moved on with her life. That protection required awareness. The thought of being watched, monitored, observed from the shadows for 19 years made Lena's skin crawl. But another thought pushed through her revulsion. If Marco had been watching her, he would know about the other strange incidents in her life. The break-in at her aunt's house when she was 12, dismissed as teenage vandals. The car that had followed her home from a college party, only to disappear when she pulled into a well-lit area. The sense, sometimes, of being observed when she was alone. Maybe she hadn't been paranoid. Maybe she'd been right. Who were they? Lena asked. The organization. Who killed my parents? A cartel operating throughout the Northeast. They specialized in money laundering, drug trafficking, and eliminating threats to their operation. Your father's evidence would have exposed them, so they eliminated him. Efficiently, brutally, without hesitation. Were. Lena caught the past tense. They don't exist anymore? They exist, Marco corrected. But they've evolved, changed leadership, shifted operations. The men who gave the order to kill your parents are long dead. I made certain of that. But the organization itself is like a hydra. Cut off one head, two more grow in its place. The casual admission of revenge sent a chill down Lena's spine. Marco Valenti spoke about orchestrating deaths with the same calm precision someone else might use to discuss a business transaction. Because that's exactly what it was to him, Lena realized. Business. What are you? She asked. Specifically, no euphemisms. Marco's smile was thin and humorless. I think you already know, Miss Carter. You're an intelligent woman. Say it. I operate outside the law. I manage interests that require discretion and occasionally violence. I inherited my brother's empire after his death and spent the last 19 years building something more strategic, more controlled than what came before. Does that satisfy your need for clarity? You're a criminal. I prefer entrepreneur with flexible ethics, but yes, if we're being reductive, I operate in criminal spaces. Marco leaned back in his chair, completely at ease with the admission. And that criminal operation is the only reason you're still alive. My connections, my resources, my willingness to use violence when necessary, these things kept you safe when law enforcement failed to protect your parents. Lena wanted to argue, to insist that vigilante justice wasn't justice at all, that operating outside the law made him no better than the people who'd killed her family. But she was standing in his study, in his home, because the law had failed. Police had labeled her parents' murder an accident and moved on. No investigation, no justice, no accountability, just a 7-year-old girl orphaned by violence disguised as misfortune. I should leave, Lena said, though she made no move toward the door. I should take your wallet and leave and pretend I never saw that photograph. You could, Marco agreed, but you won't, because now you know the truth, and the truth changes everything. You can't unknow what I've told you, Miss Carter. The question is what you plan to do with that knowledge. It was a test, Lena realized. Marco was watching her with the same calculating assessment he'd shown when he first opened the door, measuring her response, gauging her character. Whatever he saw made him reach a decision. He pulled a business card from his desk drawer and held it out. My private number. If you want to know more about your parents, about what they discovered, about the people responsible, call me. If you decide you'd rather maintain the fiction of ignorance, throw the card away. But make that choice consciously, knowing that some questions once asked can never be unasked. Lena took the card. The cardstock was thick, expensive, printed with only a phone number and nothing else. No name, no business, no context. The kind of card someone carried when they didn't need to advertise their identity. Why are you helping me? She asked. After 19 years of watching from a distance, why tell me any of this now? Marco's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Because you found the photograph. Because you had the courage to come here and demand answers instead of running away. Because you deserve to know the truth about the people who gave you life. He paused. And because you remind me that some debts can never be fully repaid, only honored through action. Lena slipped the card into her pocket. She didn't know yet if she would call, didn't know if she was brave enough or foolish enough to dive deeper into a past that had been violently buried. But she knew she couldn't walk away pretending this conversation hadn't happened. "The photograph," she said. "Can I keep it?" Marco retrieved the image from the folder and handed it to her. His fingers brushed hers for just a moment, and Lena felt the calluses there. The hands of someone who'd done more than sign papers and give orders. Hands that had held weapons, she thought. Hands that had delivered the violence he spoke about so calmly. "It's yours," he said. "It always was." Lena left the brownstone with the photograph, the wallet, and more questions than she'd arrived with. The Tribeca streets were quiet in the early evening, the city settling into its nighttime rhythm. She walked for blocks without direction, her mind replaying every word Marco had said, every implication she was still processing. Her parents had been brave. They'd discovered criminal activity and tried to stop it, knowing it was dangerous, doing it anyway. That heroism had cost them their lives, had orphaned their daughter, had set in motion 19 years of secrets and protection. Lena had never known existed, and she'd spent those 19 years thinking they'd simply been unlucky, victims of wet roads and bad timing. The rage that burned through her wasn't hot and explosive. It was cold, clear, crystallizing into something hard and determined. Someone had stolen her parents, stolen her childhood, stolen 19 years of truth. Someone had executed two people whose only crime was choosing courage over safety. And those people were still out there, still operating, still believing they'd gotten away with murder. Lena pulled out her phone and stared at Marco's business card. She could throw it away, go back to her small apartment and her struggling photography business and her normal life. She could choose safety over knowledge, ignorance over danger. But her parents hadn't chosen safety. Antonio Valenti hadn't chosen safety. They'd chosen to fight, even knowing it might kill them. Lena dialed the number on the card. Marco answered on the second ring. "I wondered how long it would take you to call." "I want to know everything," Lena said. "Every detail about what my parents discovered, about the organization, about what happened that night, and then I want to know how to make them pay." There was a pause on the line, and when Marco spoke again, his voice held something that might have been approval. "Come back tomorrow, 8 o'clock. Come prepared to hear things that will change how you see the world." "I'm already prepared," Lena said. "My world changed the moment I saw that photograph." She ended the call and stood on the Tribeca sidewalk, watching the city move around her with new eyes. Somewhere in this city, the people who'd murdered her parents walked free, confident in their safety, certain they'd buried their crimes so deep no one would ever uncover them. They were wrong. Lena Carter had spent 19 years being the good orphan, the girl who survived tragedy and built a quiet life from the ashes. She'd been careful, cautious, always playing by rules designed to keep her small and safe. But safety was an illusion. She'd learned that at 7 years old, even if it had taken 19 years to understand the lesson. Now it was time to stop hiding from the truth. Time to stop accepting the story she'd been told. Time to find out exactly what her parents had died protecting and make sure their sacrifice meant something. Tomorrow she would go back to Marco Valenti's brownstone and demand the full story. She would learn the names of the people responsible. She would understand the criminal empire her father had tried to expose. And then, somehow, she would make sure justice finally found them, even if that justice had to come from outside the law that had failed her family so completely. The photograph in her pocket felt like a promise now rather than a mystery. 7-year-old Lena smiled up from that captured moment, frozen in the last innocent days before violence shattered everything. But Lena wasn't 7 anymore. She was 26, angry, determined, and finally ready to ask the questions that should have been asked 19 years ago. Some accidents aren't accidents at all. Some deaths are executions. Some orphans are made by choice, not chance. And some debts, no matter how old, eventually come due. Lena barely slept that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the photograph on her nightstand catching streetlight from the window. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her parents' faces, not as she remembered them from childhood, but as they must have looked in those final moments, knowing death was coming, unable to protect the daughter they'd left sleeping safely at a friend's house. Riley knocked softly on her bedroom door around 3 in the morning. "I can hear you thinking from across the hall. Want to talk about it?" "My parents were murdered," Lena said to the darkness. Saying it aloud made it real in a way that Marco's revelation hadn't. "They were killed because my father tried to do the right thing." The mattress dipped as Riley sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't offer empty comfort or try to convince Lena she was wrong. Instead, she just sat there, a silent presence in the dark, and somehow that helped more than words could have. "What are you going to do?" Riley asked finally. "I'm going back tomorrow. Marco said he'd tell me everything." Lena turned her head to look at her friend's silhouette. "I need you to know that if something happens to me, if I disappear, or if something goes wrong, there's a folder on my laptop desktop labeled Insurance. It has copies of everything. The photograph, Marco's information, all my research. Promise me you'll take it to the police." "Jesus, Lena, this is insane. You're talking like you might die." "People already died for this. My parents, Marco's brother, probably others I don't know about yet. I'm not being dramatic, I'm being realistic." Riley grabbed her hand in the darkness, squeezing hard enough to hurt. "Then don't go. Let it stay buried. Your parents wouldn't want you to die trying to avenge them." "I'm not trying to avenge them," Lena said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I'm trying to understand them. I'm trying to know who they really were, beyond the sanitized memories of a 7-year-old. Don't I deserve that?" Riley didn't answer, but she didn't let go of Lena's hand either. They sat together in the dark until dawn started to gray the windows, neither of them sleeping, both of them knowing that tomorrow would change everything. Lena spent the day in a fog of anticipation and dread. She went through the motions of normal life, editing photos from the gala, responding to emails about upcoming shoots, pretending the world hadn't fundamentally shifted. But her mind kept circling back to the evening ahead, to the truths waiting to be revealed in Marco Valenti's Tribeca study. She dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing jeans and a black sweater that made her feel armored rather than vulnerable. The pepper spray went in her jacket pocket. Her phone was fully charged, Riley's number on speed dial. She was as prepared as someone could be for a meeting that might destroy whatever remained of her understanding of the past. Marco answered the door himself again, dressed similarly to the night before. Expensive casual, the uniform of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His dark eyes assessed her with that same calculating intelligence, taking in details she couldn't begin to guess at. "Miss Carter, punctual, come in." The study looked different in the evening light, shadows gathering in corners despite the warm glow of table lamps. Marco had cleared his desk except for several folders arranged in precise order. Lena recognized the methodical organization of someone about to deliver difficult information systematically. "Sit," Marco said, gesturing to the same leather chair. "Can I offer you something to drink? Coffee, water, something stronger?" "Water is fine." Lena's throat felt dry, her nerves manifesting in physical symptoms she couldn't quite control. Marco poured water from a crystal pitcher into 2 glasses, added ice, handed one to her before taking his seat behind the desk. The ritual gave Lena a moment to steady herself, to remember why she was here. "Before we begin," Marco said, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is dangerous knowledge. Simply knowing these details makes you a potential target. Are you certain you want to continue?" Lena thought of her parents, of 19 years of not knowing, of the photograph that proved someone had been watching her childhood with predatory intent. "I'm certain." Marco nodded once, accepting her decision. He opened the first folder revealing documents that looked official, police reports, newspaper clippings, photographs. "Your father, David Carter, was an accountant, but you knew that. What you didn't know was that he was exceptionally good at his job. He had a gift for seeing patterns in numbers, for finding discrepancies that others missed." He slid a document across the desk. Lena recognized it as some kind of financial statement, though the details meant little to her untrained eye. "This was from a small shipping company in Westchester, one of several businesses your father managed accounts for. On the surface, everything looked legitimate, but your father noticed something. The numbers were too perfect. Revenue and expenses aligned in ways that real businesses rarely achieve. It suggested the books were being manufactured rather than reported. Money laundering, Lena said, remembering Marco's explanation from the night before. Exactly. Your father started documenting the discrepancies, creating a parallel set of books that showed the real transactions versus the reported ones. He built a case over several months, working carefully, making sure he had irrefutable evidence. Marco's expression held something like respect. He was thorough, professional. He understood he was dealing with dangerous people and took precautions. But not enough precautions, Lena said bitterly. No, because the organization he'd stumbled onto was more extensive than he realized. The shipping company was just one piece of a network that stretched throughout the Northeast. The cartel, we'll call them the Castillo organization, after their leader at the time, specialized in moving drug money through legitimate businesses. Your father's evidence would have exposed not just one company, but dozens, hundreds of millions of dollars, connections to politicians, police, judges, the kind of exposure that organizations kill to prevent. Marco opened a second folder, this one containing photographs of men Lena didn't recognize. Their faces were hard, weathered, the eyes of people who'd seen and done terrible things. These were the Castillo organization's leadership in 2005. Most of them are dead now, some from law enforcement, some from rival organizations, some from me, but at the time they were powerful. And when they discovered your father was building a case against them, they acted swiftly. How did they find out? Lena asked. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears, as if someone else was asking the questions. There was an informant in the district attorney's office. Your father had made preliminary contact with a prosecutor, testing the waters to see if his evidence would be taken seriously. The informant notified the Castillo organization within hours. After that, your father's death was just a matter of timing and method. The casual way Marco discussed her father's murder made Lena's stomach turn, but she forced herself to listen, to absorb every detail. She'd asked for the truth. She couldn't flinch from it now. Where does your brother fit into this? She asked. Marco's expression shifted, something almost human flickering behind his controlled facade. Antonio was complicated. He worked within the criminal world, but he had lines he wouldn't cross. Children, innocents, people who were just trying to live honest lives. These were sacred to him. When he learned that the Castillo organization was targeting your father, he made contact. Tried to convince your father to disappear, to take his family and run rather than testify. My father refused, Lena guessed. He refused. He believed in the system, in justice, in doing the right thing even when it was dangerous. Antonio respected that even if he thought it was foolish. Marco pulled out another photograph, this one showing a man who looked like a younger version of himself. Same dark hair, same sharp features, but with eyes that held warmth Marco's lacked. Antonio decided that if he couldn't convince your father to run, he'd protect him instead. He started his own surveillance, documenting threats, trying to identify the people the Castillo organization would send. The photograph, Lena said, pulling the image from her pocket. This was part of that surveillance. Yes. Antonio was watching your house that day. He'd identified several concerning indicators, cars driving by slowly multiple times, unfamiliar faces in the neighborhood, phone calls to your home that disconnected when answered. He was building his own case, trying to find evidence he could use to leverage protection for your family. Marco's jaw tightened, and Lena saw the guilt there, buried under years of controlled emotion but still present, still raw. I was 22, Marco continued, ambitious, arrogant, building my own operations and viewing Antonio's concerns as distractions. When he told me he needed help protecting a witness, I told him to handle it himself. I was too important, too busy, too focused on my own empire to care about some accountant I'd never met. The admission hung between them, heavy with the weight of consequences that could never be undone. They killed your parents on August 7th, Marco said. Made it look like an accident. Tampered with the brake lines, chose a rainy night, a dangerous curve. Your father lost control exactly where they'd calculated he would. The car hit the tree at high speed. They died on impact. Lena's hands trembled. She set down her water glass before she could drop it, pressing her palms flat against her thighs. The details made it real in a visceral way. Not just murder, but calculated, cold-blooded execution disguised as misfortune. Antonio found out 12 hours later, Marco continued. He went to the Castillo organization's headquarters in the Bronx and confronted them, alone, furious, demanding to know why they'd killed people under his protection. Marco's voice grew rough. They shot him in the parking lot. 23 bullets. They wanted to make a statement about what happened to people who interfered with their business. I'm sorry, Lena whispered, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of the loss. Don't be sorry for me. Be sorry for yourself, for your parents, for Antonio. Be sorry that good people died while bastards like me survived. Marco stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back to her. I inherited Antonio's empire and spent the next year hunting every single person involved in your parents' death. The Castillo leadership, the men who tampered with the car, the informant in the DA's office, everyone. I made them suffer, and then I made them disappear. The confession should have horrified Lena. Instead, she felt a savage satisfaction that someone had delivered consequences, even if those consequences came from outside the law. Did it help, she asked. The revenge. Did it make Antonio's death easier to live with? Marco turned to face her, and his expression was stark with an honesty she hadn't expected. No, but it made sure your parents' murder meant something. It made sure the people responsible understood there were still consequences in this world, even if the law failed to deliver them. Lena stood and walked to where Marco stood by the window. Below them, Tribeca's streets glowed with evening traffic, people going about their normal lives, completely unaware of the conversation happening in this elegant study. You said the organization still exists, Lena said. Different leadership, different operations. What does that mean exactly? The Castillo organization evolved. New leadership took over, they diversified operations, moved into different territories. They're more careful now, more strategic. They learned from their mistakes. Marco pulled out his phone and opened a photograph, showing it to Lena. This is Victor Reyes. He runs what remains of the Castillo organization now. Legitimate businesses fronting for drug trafficking, money laundering, human smuggling. He's smart, ruthless, and very careful about avoiding the mistakes that got his predecessors killed. The man in the photo was perhaps 50, distinguished looking, wearing an expensive suit and standing outside what looked like a corporate office. He could have been a banker or lawyer or businessman. Nothing about him screamed criminal. He's the one? Lena asked. He's responsible now? He's responsible for continuing the enterprise that killed your parents, yes. Though he wasn't directly involved in 2005, he was too junior then. But he benefited from their deaths, built his power on the foundation their murder helped protect. Lena stared at Victor Reyes' face, memorizing every feature. This was the human face of the organization that had destroyed her family. This was the man who profited from her parents' blood. I want him to pay, she said quietly. Wanting and achieving are different things, Miss Carter. Victor Reyes has spent 15 years making himself untouchable. He has connections throughout law enforcement, legitimate businesses that shield his criminal operations, and enough money to buy his way out of most problems. He's not someone you can simply attack. But he can be hurt, Lena insisted. There must be a way. You said my father found vulnerabilities in the money laundering operation. Those vulnerabilities must still exist. Marco studied her with renewed interest, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. You're not talking about revenge. You're talking about exposure. My father tried to expose them through the law and died for it, but the evidence he gathered, does it still exist? Some of it. Antonio salvaged what he could before the DA's office was compromised. I've kept it all these years, adding to it when I could. Marco moved back to his desk and opened a locked drawer, pulling out a thick file. Financial records, witness statements, documentation of criminal activities spanning 2 decades. More than enough to destroy the Castillo organization if it were delivered to the right people. Then why haven't you done it? Lena demanded. Because delivering it to the right people assumes such people exist. The corruption that allowed your parents to be killed hasn't disappeared, Miss Carter. It's evolved, just like the organization itself. Giving this evidence to law enforcement could just warn Reyes that someone's investigating, giving him time to eliminate witnesses and destroy records. Lena paced the study, her mind racing through possibilities. Her father had died trying to work within the system. Antonio had died trying to protect him. Traditional justice had failed completely. But that didn't mean justice itself was impossible. It just meant they'd been looking in the wrong direction. What if we don't give it to law enforcement? Lena said slowly. What if we make it public? Media, investigative journalists, social media. Make the evidence so widespread that Reyes can't silence everyone. Marco's expression shifted, something like approval crossing his features. That's dangerous. The moment you make that information public, you paint a target on your back. Reyes will know you're the source, and he will come after you with everything he has. He's been coming after my family for 19 years, Lena shot back. My parents, Antonio, probably other people I don't even know about. At least this way, I'm choosing the fight instead of waiting to be targeted. There's another problem, Marco said. The evidence Antonio collected is extensive but not complete. To really destroy Reyes's operation, we'd need current financial records, documentation of active criminal enterprises, proof that connects him personally to ongoing crimes. Everything we have is historical. It might damage him, but it wouldn't destroy him. Lena stopped pacing and faced Marco directly. Then we get the current evidence. We find a way into his operation and document everything. We? Marco raised an eyebrow. Miss Carter, you're a photographer, not an investigator or criminal. What exactly do you think you can contribute to infiltrating a sophisticated criminal organization? The dismissal stung, but Lena refused to back down. I can do what my father did. Look for patterns, document discrepancies, find the vulnerabilities. You said he was good at seeing what others missed. Maybe I inherited that skill. Your father had accounting expertise and access to their financial records. You have a camera and righteous anger. Those aren't the same thing. But I also have something my father didn't, Lena countered. I have you. Your connections, your resources, your understanding of how these organizations work. He was trying to fight them alone. I don't have to. Marco was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Lena could practically see him calculating risks and benefits, weighing her usefulness against the danger of involving a civilian. If I were to help you, he said finally, carefully, it would have to be on my terms. You would follow my instructions exactly, take no unnecessary risks, and accept that I might pull you out at any moment if I determine the danger is too great. And you would need to understand that what we'd be doing isn't legal or safe or guaranteed to succeed. I understand, Lena said immediately. I don't think you do. Marco moved closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the intimate space of the study. I've spent 19 years watching you from a distance, making sure you stayed safe, ensuring you could live a normal life. If you do this, that normal life ends. There's no going back to being just a photographer trying to make rent in the East Village. You'll be someone who challenged a criminal organization, and even if we succeed, that shadow never fully disappears. Lena thought of her small apartment, her struggling business, her quiet existence on the margins of a city that barely noticed her. She thought of Riley's dreams of acting success, of the simple pleasures of Sunday brunch and gallery openings and normal human concerns. She thought of the life she'd built from the ashes of her parents' death, the careful reconstruction of something resembling safety. And then she thought of her parents' faces, of Antonio Valenti bleeding out in a parking lot, of Victor Reyes walking free and powerful while the people who'd tried to stop him rotted in graves. I've been living in that shadow my whole life, Lena said. I just didn't know it. At least this way I'm choosing to step into the light. Marco searched her face for a long moment, looking for doubt or fear or hesitation. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded once. Then we begin tomorrow. But tonight, you go home and think carefully about this decision. Talk to your friend, the one who waited up with you last night. Make sure someone knows what you're planning. And if you change your mind before tomorrow evening, there's no shame in that. I won't change my mind, Lena said. We'll see. Marco walked her to the door, his hand briefly touching her shoulder, a gesture that might have been reassurance or warning. 8 o'clock tomorrow. Come prepared to work. Lena left the brownstone with her head spinning and her heart racing. The night air was cool against her flushed skin, and she walked several blocks before her thoughts settled enough to call Riley. Well, Riley answered immediately. Are you alive? Are you okay? Should I call the police? I'm fine. I'm coming home. We need to talk. Riley was waiting in the living room when Lena got back, 2 cups of tea already steaming on the coffee table and worry written across her face. Lena sat down and told her everything. Marco's revelations, the evidence that still existed, the plan forming to expose Victor Reyes and the organization that had murdered her parents. "This is insane," Riley said when Lena finished. "You're talking about going after actual criminals, people who kill witnesses, people who murdered your parents." "I know. And you're going to do it anyway." "I have to, Riley. I can't know what I know now and just go back to normal life. I can't pretend my parents died in an accident when I know they were executed. I can't let the people responsible keep profiting from their murder." Riley grabbed both of Lena's hands, holding tight. "Then promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't take stupid risks. Promise me you'll remember that your parents wouldn't want you to die trying to avenge them." "I promise," Lena said, hoping it was a promise she could keep. They sat together on the couch until late, Riley asking questions and Lena answering what she could, both of them knowing that tomorrow would mark a dividing line between before and after. Eventually, Riley fell asleep, her head on Lena's shoulder, exhausted by worry and fear. Lena stayed awake, staring at the photograph of her 7-year-old self and wondering what that innocent child would think of what she was about to do. The next evening, Lena returned to Marco's brownstone with a notebook, her camera, and a determination that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Marco answered the door in shirt sleeves and a shoulder holster that held a gun he made no attempt to conceal. "Ready to begin?" he asked. "Yes." The study had been transformed. A large table now dominated the center of the room, covered with files, photographs, maps, and documents. It looked like something from a police investigation, except the investigator was a criminal and the target was someone the law had failed to stop. "This is everything I have on Victor Reyes and the current Castillo organization," Marco said, gesturing to the organized chaos. "Financial records, property holdings, known associates, business fronts. You're going to learn all of it." "All of this?" Lena stared at the overwhelming volume of information. "You wanted to understand how criminal organizations work. This is how you learn, by studying the actual operations, seeing how legitimate businesses hide illegal activities, understanding the networks that make it all possible." Marco pulled out a chair for her. "Sit. We'll start with the basics." For the next 4 hours, Marco walked Lena through the architecture of a modern criminal enterprise. He explained how Victor Reyes used a real estate development company to launder drug money, how construction projects with inflated costs hid cash transactions, how shell corporations and offshore accounts made tracking the actual flow of money nearly impossible. Lena took notes frantically, her photographer's eye helping her see the patterns Marco described. The way multiple companies all shared the same registered agent, the properties that changed hands between related entities at prices that made no economic sense, the construction projects that dragged on for years, always needing more funding, always somehow profitable despite obvious inefficiencies. "It's brilliant in its way," Marco said with something like professional admiration. Reyes learned from his predecessor's mistakes. Everything has a legitimate explanation. Every transaction has proper documentation. On paper, he's just a successful real estate developer. Proving otherwise requires connecting dozens of pieces across multiple jurisdictions, tracking money through layers of corporate structure, and finding witnesses willing to testify. "My father found the connections," Lena said. "In 2005, with fewer resources and less sophisticated operations. We can do it again." "Your father had access to the actual financial records. We have fragments, educated guesses, and information that's already outdated." Marco leaned back in his chair, studying her. "To really build a case, we'd need someone on the inside, someone who could access current financial systems, document active transactions, provide the kind of evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away." An idea sparked in Lena's mind. "What if that someone was me?" Marco's expression darkened. "Absolutely not. Reyes's organization doesn't hire random photographers off the street, and even if they did, putting you inside would be suicide. They have security, background checks, connections that would identify you as David Carter's daughter within days." "Not as a photographer," Lena said, her thoughts racing ahead. "And not under my real name. But what if there was another way in? A position they're actually hiring for, someone who'd have access to records without seeming suspicious?" "What are you suggesting?" Lena stood and moved to the table, scanning through the documents until she found what she was looking for. A newspaper article about one of Reyes's recent real estate projects. The photo showed him at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, flanked by staff members and city officials. He has assistants, staff, people who manage his schedule and communications. Those people have access to offices, files, computers. They're trusted because they're supposed to be invisible, just administrative support, not worth securing against. Lena looked up at Marco. What if I became one of those invisible people? Marco was silent, but she could see him considering it, weighing the risks against the potential access such a position would provide. It would require a complete identity, he said finally, background that holds up to investigation, references that check out, a persona that seems legitimate enough to get hired but unremarkable enough not to attract suspicion. Can you do that? Create that kind of identity? I can. The question is whether you can maintain it under pressure. One slip, one moment where you forget your cover story or react to something you shouldn't know, and you're exposed. And if you're exposed inside Reyes's organization, you won't walk out alive. The blunt assessment should have terrified Lena. Instead, it clarified her resolve. This was real, dangerous, potentially fatal, and she was choosing it anyway. Teach me, she said. Teach me how to create a cover identity, how to maintain it, how to access information without being caught. You've done this before. You know how it works? Marco studied her for a long moment, and Lena had the sense of being evaluated against some internal standard she couldn't see. Finally, he nodded. We'll start tomorrow. Creating a bulletproof identity takes time, documents, history, digital footprint, everything that makes a person real in the modern world. While I handle that, you'll learn surveillance, information gathering, and how to recognize when you're in danger. This isn't something you can rush. How long? A month, maybe 6 weeks. Reyes's organization is always hiring. Turnover is high when you work for criminals who occasionally kill their employees. But we need to make sure you're ready, that your identity is solid, that we have extraction plans if things go wrong. 6 weeks felt like an eternity when Lena's entire body vibrated with the need to act. But she forced herself to nod, to accept the timeline, to understand that patience now might mean survival later. There's something else you need to know, Marco said. He pulled out another file, this one marked with Lena's name. I told you I kept watch over you for 19 years. That protection included monitoring for any indication that the Castillo organization knew about you, that they saw you as a threat or loose end. And? Lena's stomach tightened. For 18 years, nothing. You were just a tragic orphan who'd moved on with her life. But 6 months ago, something changed. Marco opened the file, revealing surveillance photos, pictures of Lena leaving her apartment, walking through Manhattan, working at various photography gigs. Someone started watching you, different people, rotating surveillance, professional enough that you probably never noticed. The photos made Lena's skin crawl. Strangers had been following her, documenting her movements, invading her privacy in ways she'd never suspected. Who? She demanded. I don't know yet. The surveillance is sophisticated enough that I haven't been able to identify who's running it. It could be Reyes's organization checking on David Carter's daughter after all these years. It could be law enforcement investigating connections they don't understand. It could be someone else entirely. Marco's expression was grim. But whoever they are, they're interested in you, and that makes what we're planning even more dangerous. Lena stared at the surveillance photos, at images of herself going about her daily life, completely unaware she was being watched. The violation felt personal, intimate, a reminder that her privacy had been an illusion for longer than she'd known. Then we use it, she said. If they're already watching me, we feed them information that supports whatever identity you create. We make them see exactly what we want them to see. A slow smile crossed Marco's face. You think like your father. He understood that sometimes the best defense is controlling the narrative. My father's dead because he tried to work within a system that was already corrupted, Lena said. I'm not making that mistake. Marco closed the file and looked at her with an expression that might have been respect or might have been concern. Then we move forward. But remember what I told you, this changes everything. Once we start, there's no going back to normal. Normal died in 2005, Lena said. I've just been pretending otherwise. She walked out of Marco's brownstone that night feeling as though she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't uncross. The Manhattan streets looked the same neon signs reflecting in puddles, same rush of taxis hunting fares, same endless churn of humanity, but Lena moved through it all with new awareness. Any of these faces could be watching her. Any of these strangers could be part of the surveillance Marco had documented. The thought should have paralyzed her with fear. Instead, it sharpened her focus. Over the next 6 weeks, Lena lived a double life that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. By day, she maintained her normal routine, photography gigs, coffee with Riley, the mundane rhythms of survival in New York. By night, she disappeared into Marco's world, learning skills she'd never imagined needing. He taught her how to build a cover identity from the ground up. Her new name was Lena Morse, a composite of her real name twisted just enough to feel unfamiliar on her tongue. Marco fabricated a complete history, college transcripts from a small Midwest school, employment records at businesses that existed but wouldn't remember one unremarkable administrative assistant, social media accounts populated with generic posts and stock photography that suggested a life lived quietly, without drama or distinction. The key to a good cover is boring consistency, Marco explained one evening as they reviewed Lena Morse's fabricated past. People remember extremes, the brilliant employee, the disaster, the one with the tragic story. They forget the competent, pleasant person who shows up on time and does adequate work. That's who Lena Morse is. Forgettable. Lena studied the woman she was supposed to become. Lena had graduated with a business degree and worked various administrative positions before moving to New York 6 months ago. She had no criminal record, no controversial social media presence, no red flags that would trigger deeper investigation. She was exactly the kind of person who could disappear into the machinery of a busy office without anyone looking twice. "What about references?" Lena asked. "They'll call previous employers." "Already handled. I have people in place who'll confirm Elena's employment history if contacted. The key is making sure the story holds up to standard background checks without being so impressive it attracts attention." But creating an identity was only the first step. Marco also trained Lena in the practical skills she'd need to survive inside a criminal organization. He taught her surveillance awareness, how to spot a tail, how to check for listening devices, how to recognize when she was being watched. He showed her dead drops and secure communication methods, ways to pass information without direct contact that could be observed. "In Reyes's office, assume everything is monitored," Marco said during one late-night training session. "Phones, computers, even conversations in supposedly private spaces. You document what you see, memorize what you can't photograph, and wait for secure opportunities to communicate." "How will I know when it's secure?" "You won't. Not completely. That's why we're establishing protocols now." Marco pulled out a burner phone, one of a dozen identical devices he kept in a locked drawer. "Every 3 days, you'll send a single emoji to this number. A coffee cup means everything is normal. A sun means you have information, but aren't in immediate danger. A red exclamation mark means you need emergency extraction. If I don't receive a message within 72 hours, I assume you're compromised and initiate rescue protocols." The clinical way he discussed rescue protocols made Lena's stomach turn. But she forced herself to memorize the procedures, to practice the signals until they became automatic. Her life might depend on these details. The surveillance training was the most unsettling. Marco would have his people follow Lena through Manhattan, and she'd have to identify them, lose them, or determine if she was being watched without making it obvious she knew. The first week, she failed spectacularly, never noticing the watchers until Marco showed her photographs of herself being tracked through her daily routine. "I didn't see any of them," Lena admitted, frustrated. "That's the point. Professional surveillance is invisible until you know what to look for." Marco spread the photos across his desk. "Notice anything about these images?" Lena studied them carefully. In each photo, there were people in the background: a man reading a newspaper, a woman checking her phone, a jogger stretching. Different people, different locations, nothing obviously connected. "The jogger appears in 3 photos," Lena said slowly. "Different clothes, but same build, same running style." "Good. What else?" "The woman with the phone. Her jacket appears in 2 photos, but different people are wearing it." Marco nodded. "They rotate clothes and positions, but use the same limited team. Once you know the patterns, surveillance becomes visible. The goal isn't to catch them, that alerts them you're aware. The goal is to know you're being watched so you can control what they see. By the third week, Lena could spot Marco's surveillance teams within an hour. By the fifth week, she could identify them within minutes and plan her movements accordingly. The city transformed from a backdrop into a chessboard, every interaction calculated, every movement strategic. Riley noticed the change, of course. One Sunday morning over coffee, she studied Lena with worried eyes. "You're different," Riley said bluntly. "Harder, somehow. You're always watching everyone, analyzing everything. It's like you're expecting an attack." Lena wanted to deny it, to insist she was fine, that nothing had changed. But Riley deserved better than comfortable lies. "I'm learning to protect myself," Lena said carefully, "learning to see threats before they become dangerous." "And that's what you want? To live your life constantly scanning for danger?" "It's what I need, at least until this is finished." Riley reached across the small cafe table and grabbed Lena's hand. "Just promise me you won't lose yourself completely. Promise me there's still room for the person you were before all this started." Lena squeezed back but couldn't make that promise. She barely recognized the person she'd been 6 weeks ago, the struggling photographer who worried about rent and booking gigs and normal human concerns. That Lena had been soft, unaware, vulnerable. This Lena was learning to be hard, strategic, dangerous in her own way. She wasn't sure which version was more real. The transformation extended beyond surveillance skills. Marco also taught Lena how to read people, how to identify lies and manipulations, how to recognize the subtle power dynamics that govern criminal organizations. "Reyes's people will test you," Marco explained during one evening session. "Small tests at first, asking you to bend minor rules, observing how you react to inappropriate requests, seeing if you gossip or ask questions. If you pass those tests, the asks get bigger. If you fail, you're either eliminated or kept in a position with no real access." "So I need to pass," Lena said. "You need to pass carefully. Too eager and you seem suspicious. Too reluctant and you limit your access. You have to find the middle ground, someone who's willing to be useful without being dangerously curious." They practiced scenarios endlessly. Marco would play various roles: the friendly coworker trying to extract information, the aggressive superior testing boundaries, the concerned colleague warning about dangers. Lena learned to deflect questions without seeming evasive, to redirect conversations without triggering suspicion, to build relationships that seemed genuine while maintaining careful emotional distance. "Remember," Marco said, after one particularly grueling practice session, "everyone in that office is either a criminal or someone willing to work for criminals. That doesn't make them evil, necessarily, but it means they've all made calculations about what they're willing to accept in exchange for a paycheck. You need to seem like you've made the same calculation." "What calculation is that?" "That money and stability matter more than asking uncomfortable questions about where that money comes from. That's the bargain everyone in Reyes's office has made, whether they admit it to themselves or not." As the weeks progressed, Marco also shared more about his own organization, helping Lena understand the landscape she was entering. He ran what he called a strategic operation, criminal enterprises that avoided unnecessary violence, maintained strict codes about civilian casualties, and operated with a level of professionalism that separated him from cruder organizations. "I'm not a good person," Marco said bluntly during one late-night conversation. "I break laws, I profit from illegal activities, I've killed people who threaten my operations. But I have rules. No children, no civilians who aren't actively involved in the game, no unnecessary cruelty." The Castillo organization, Reyes's people, they don't share those limitations. To them, anyone is a potential target if eliminating them serves a purpose. "My parents," Lena said quietly. "They were civilians, innocents." "Exactly. Which is why I've spent 19 years making sure they paid for that choice, and why I'm willing to help you finish what your father started." The conversation shifted something in how Lena viewed Marco. He was still a criminal, still someone who operated outside the law, still dangerous, but he was also someone shaped by grief and guilt, someone trying to impose order on chaos, someone who'd spent nearly 2 decades carrying a 7-year-old's photograph as penance for a failure he couldn't undo. By the 6th week, Elena Morse's identity was complete. She had credit history, rental records, a digital footprint that stretched back years. Marco had even arranged for her to work briefly at a legitimate business owned by one of his associates, creating recent employment history that would check out under investigation. "You're ready," Marco said during their final preparation session. "Elena Morse is as real as any fabricated identity can be. The question is whether you're ready to become her." Lena looked at the file containing her new life. The driver's license with her photo and a stranger's name. The resume listing jobs she'd never worked. The references for a person who didn't exist. This was it. The point of no return. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. Marco pulled out another folder, this one containing information about Reyes's current operations. His primary front is Meridian Development Corporation. They're headquartered in Midtown, handle multiple real estate projects throughout the city. On paper, it's completely legitimate. In reality, it's the hub of his money laundering operation. And they're hiring? They're always hiring. Administrative turnover is high. People figure out what the company really does and either quit or get fired for asking questions. Elena Morse will apply for an executive assistant position that opened up last week. Based on her credentials, she should at least get an interview. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Elena would apply like any normal job seeker, go through standard interviews, and hopefully get hired. Once inside, she'd have access to offices, files, and the kind of mundane daily operations where criminal activity hid in plain sight. "What exactly am I looking for?" Lena asked. "Financial records that show the real transactions behind legitimate expenses. Communications that discuss illegal activities, names and roles of people involved in the criminal enterprise. Anything that connects Reyes personally to illegal operations." Marco leaned back in his chair. "Your father found the patterns in the numbers. You need to do the same thing, but more carefully, more strategically, with the understanding that one mistake could get you killed." The weight of what she was about to attempt settled over Lena like a physical pressure. She would be walking into a criminal organization surrounded by people who'd killed to protect their secrets, searching for evidence while pretending to be exactly the kind of forgettable assistant who saw nothing suspicious. "When do I apply?" she asked. "Tomorrow. Then we wait. If they call you in for an interview, we'll do final preparation. If they don't, we find another angle." Marco studied her face. "You can still back out. No shame in deciding this is too dangerous." Lena thought of her parents, of the photograph that had started this entire journey, of 19 years spent not knowing the truth. She thought of Victor Reyes living free and powerful, while the people who'd tried to stop him moldered in graves. "I'm not backing out," she said firmly. The next morning, Elena Morse submitted her application to Meridian Development Corporation. 2 days later, she received a call scheduling an interview. And 3 days after that, Lena Carter walked into a Midtown office building as someone else entirely. The Meridian offices occupied the 20th floor of a glass tower that screamed corporate success. Everything was sleek, expensive, carefully designed to project legitimacy. Elena, she had to think of herself as Elena now, checked in with the receptionist and tried to control her racing pulse. The woman who interviewed her was perhaps 40, sharply dressed, with the kind of efficient competence that came from managing chaos daily. Her name was Patricia Chen, and she served as Victor Reyes's chief of staff. "Tell me about your previous experience," Patricia said, reviewing Elena's fabricated resume. Lena launched into the story she'd rehearsed dozens of times with Marco. Quiet competence, reliable but unremarkable, someone who'd worked various administrative positions without leaving a strong impression either way. The perfect invisible assistant. Patricia asked standard interview questions, and Lena gave carefully crafted answers that suggested capability without brilliance. She was good enough to be useful, boring enough to be trusted, unmemorable enough to fade into the background. "Why did you leave your last position?" Patricia asked. "The company downsized. My entire department was eliminated." The lie came smoothly. Marco had ensured that Elena's previous employer would confirm this story if contacted. "And why Meridian?" "I'm looking for stability, a company that's growing, where there's opportunity for long-term employment." Lena maintained eye contact, but not too intensely, engaged but not aggressive. "Real estate development seems like a stable industry. Patricia's expression gave nothing away. She asked a few more questions, standard interview fare that Lena handled easily. Then she leaned back in her chair, studying Lena with shrewd eyes. "This position requires discretion," Patricia said carefully. "You'll be handling sensitive information, working directly with executives on confidential matters. We need someone who understands that what happens in this office stays in this office." The test Marco had warned about. Lena nodded seriously. "I understand completely. In my previous positions, I handled confidential information regularly. I've never had an issue maintaining appropriate discretion. Even when that information might be uncomfortable?" Patricia's gaze sharpened. "Even when you might not agree with certain business decisions?" "I'm an administrative assistant, not a decision maker," Lena said, channeling the careful neutrality Marco had drilled into her. "My job is to support the executives, not to question their judgment. I learned early in my career that success comes from being reliable, not from having opinions about things outside my role." Something shifted in Patricia's expression, not quite approval, but a softening of suspicion. She asked a few more questions about availability and salary expectations, then stood and extended her hand. "We'll be in touch within a few days," Patricia said. "Thank you for coming in." Lena shook her hand with exactly the right amount of firmness. Not limp, not aggressive, just appropriately professional. She thanked Patricia for her time and walked out of the office with her heart hammering but her expression calm. She made it 3 blocks before pulling out her phone and sending Marco a message. A simple coffee cup emoji. Everything normal. Interview complete. No obvious red flags. His response came within minutes. A thumbs up. Nothing more. But Lena felt the approval anyway. 4 days later, Patricia called with a job offer. Elena Morse would start the following Monday as an executive assistant, reporting directly to Patricia and occasionally supporting Victor Reyes himself. The salary was generous, suspiciously generous for an administrative position, which suggested they expected loyalty to be bought as well as earned. "I accept," Lena said, injecting just the right amount of enthusiasm into Elena's voice. "Thank you so much for this opportunity." "We're glad to have you," Patricia said. "I'll send over the paperwork and orientation details. Welcome to Meridian Development." Lena ended the call and sat in her apartment staring at her phone. She'd done it. She was in. In 5 days, she would walk into Victor Reyes's organization as an employee, gaining access to the very heart of the operation that had murdered her parents. Riley found her like that an hour later, still sitting motionless, still processing the enormity of what came next. "You got it," Riley said. It wasn't a question. "I got it." "Jesus, Lena." Riley sat beside her, grabbing her hand. "This is real now. You're really doing this." "I'm really doing this," Lena confirmed. The fear was there, sharp and immediate, but so was something else, a fierce determination that felt almost like joy. After 6 weeks of preparation, after 19 years of not knowing, she was finally taking action, finally choosing to fight instead of accepting the comfortable lies that had defined her understanding of the past. That weekend, Marco conducted final preparations. He walked Lena through the office layout he'd obtained through his own sources, identifying cameras, discussing which areas would be most secure for accessing sensitive information, planning escape routes if things went wrong. "Your goal for the first month is pure observation," Marco emphasized. "Learn the routine, understand the hierarchy, identify who has real power versus who's just following orders. Document what you can safely photograph, memorize what you can't, and wait for opportunities rather than creating them." "What about Reyes? Will I interact with him directly?" "Probably not initially. Patricia will shield him from administrative staff until she's confident you're reliable. But once you prove yourself useful, you'll have more access. That's when the real work begins." Sunday night before her first day, Lena couldn't sleep. She lay in bed running through her cover story, her planned responses to various scenarios, the techniques Marco had taught her for remaining calm under pressure. Elena Morse wasn't nervous about starting a new job. Elena was competent, experienced, grateful for the opportunity. Elena had no idea she was walking into a criminal organization. Lena had to become that person completely. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Manhattan look almost beautiful. Elena, dressed in carefully chosen professional clothes that said, competent but not memorable, and made her way to Midtown. She checked her reflection in the building's glass doors before entering. She looked exactly like she was supposed to, an administrative assistant grateful to have a good job in an expensive city. Nothing about her suggested she was David Carter's daughter, walking into the heart of the organization that had murdered her parents, carrying enough rage to burn the whole operation down. Patricia met her in the lobby and escorted her through security. The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt eternal. When the doors opened, Lena stepped into her new reality. The office was exactly as Marco had described: open workspace with cubicles for lower-level staff, private offices ringing the perimeter for executives, a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Everything screamed legitimate business. Nothing suggested the illegal empire it supported. "Your desk is here," Patricia said, leading Lena to a cubicle positioned strategically between several private offices. "You'll primarily support me, but occasionally Mr. Reyes will need assistance with scheduling, communications, or event planning. I'll introduce you to the team." The next hour was a blur of names and faces: administrative staff, junior developers, project managers, accountants, all of them seemingly normal people doing normal jobs. If Lena hadn't known what she was looking for, she never would have suspected anything unusual. But she did know. And as Patricia walked her through the office, Lena noticed the subtle tells Marco had trained her to recognize. The way certain people lowered their voices when specific topics came up. The private offices with frosted glass instead of clear. The server room that required biometric access instead of just a key card. The casual mentions of special projects that weren't elaborated on. This was a criminal organization hiding in plain sight, and she was standing in its beating heart. "You'll do great," Patricia said as she left Lena at her new desk. "Just remember, discretion is everything here. We take care of our people, but we expect loyalty in return." "I understand," Lena said with exactly the right mix of gratitude and professional confidence. Patricia smiled and walked away, leaving Lena alone at her desk with a new computer login, a stack of orientation materials, and access to the very organization that had destroyed her family. Lena took a slow breath, centered herself, and opened the first document on her screen. The real work was about to begin, and she couldn't afford a single mistake. Her parents' justice depended on it. Her own survival demanded it. She was Elena Morse now, competent, reliable, forgettable Elena Morse, and she was going to dismantle this operation from the inside. The first 2 weeks at Meridian Development were exactly what Marco had predicted, mind-numbingly normal. Lena managed Patricia's calendar, scheduled meetings, answered phones, and organized files with the kind of efficient competence that made her functionally invisible. She smiled at coworkers in the break room, made polite small talk about the weather, and asked no questions that might suggest curiosity beyond her immediate responsibilities. It was the most difficult performance of her life. Every day, she sat mere feet from the private offices where Victor Reyes and his senior staff conducted business. She could hear their voices through closed doors, catch fragments of conversations that hinted at the criminal operations hidden beneath corporate language. But she couldn't act, couldn't investigate, couldn't do anything except wait and observe while her frustration built like pressure behind a dam. She communicated with Marco through the burner phone, sending her scheduled emoji updates and occasionally adding brief encrypted messages. Coffee cup, coffee cup, coffee cup. Everything normal, nothing to report, still establishing baseline routines. His responses were always brief. Keep waiting. Patience is survival. But patience felt like torture when she knew what these people had done, when she sat in the very office that had orchestrated her parents' murder. The break came at the end of her 3rd week, though Lena didn't recognize it immediately as an opportunity. She was working late on a Friday evening, most of the office already empty, when Patricia stopped by her desk looking harried. "Elena, I need a favor," Patricia said, dropping a thick accordion file on the desk. "These are expense reports from our Brooklyn construction project. They need to be scanned and filed in the digital archive before Monday's meeting. Can you handle it?" Lena glanced at the bulging file, then at Patricia's stressed expression. "Of course. No problem. You're a lifesaver." Patricia grabbed her coat from her office. "Just scan everything to the shared drive under Brooklyn Development, organized by date. The scanner's in the copy room." She left in a rush, leaving Lena alone with the file. For a moment, Lena just stared at it, her heart beginning to race. Expense reports, financial documentation, exactly the kind of records her father had used to uncover money laundering almost 20 years ago. She carried the file to the copy room, closed the door, and started scanning. The documents were exactly what they appeared to be. Invoices, receipts, payment authorizations for construction materials and labor. But as Lena processed page after page, her photographer's eye began catching the same patterns Marco had trained her to recognize. Payments to vendors that charged prices well above market rate. Invoices for materials that seemed excessive for the project's scope. Multiple payments to the same companies but under slightly different names. The kind of inflated costs that could hide money being laundered through legitimate construction projects. Lena's hands trembled as she scanned, her mind racing. This was it. This was evidence. Not conclusive on its own, but the beginning of the pattern her father had identified in different files, in a different time. She finished scanning the legitimate copies to the shared drive as instructed. Then, working quickly and carefully, she used her phone to photograph the most suspicious documents, the ones with prices that made no economic sense, the ones that showed patterns of payments that suggested money moving through the system for purposes beyond actual construction. Every few minutes, she paused and listened. The office was silent except for the hum of the scanner and the distant sound of traffic 20 floors below. She was alone for now, but that could change at any moment. If someone walked in and found her photographing confidential documents, her cover would be destroyed and her life would likely be forfeit. But this was why she was here. This was the entire point. Lena finished photographing the key documents and returned everything to the accordion file exactly as she'd found it. She scanned the last few legitimate pages, filed the originals in the designated cabinet, and returned to her desk with her heart pounding so hard she could feel her pulse in her throat. She sat there for 10 minutes, just breathing, waiting for alarms or security or someone who'd noticed what she'd done. Nothing happened. The office remained quiet. No one came. Finally, Lena packed up her things and left, walking to the subway with forced casualness, while every instinct screamed at her to run. She made it to her apartment before allowing herself to react, locking the door behind her and sliding down to sit on the floor, shaking with adrenaline and fear and triumph. She'd done it. She'd gathered actual evidence from inside Reyes's operation. Later that night, after she'd calmed down enough to think clearly, Lena transferred the photos to an encrypted drive using the protocols Marco had taught her. Then she sent him a message. Not the regular emoji update, but the signal they'd established for actionable intelligence. A sun emoji. Information obtained, not in immediate danger. His response came within 5 minutes. A simple address in Brooklyn and a time. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. The meeting location was a small Italian restaurant in Carroll Gardens, the kind of neighborhood place where regulars were greeted by name and strangers were politely ignored. Marco was already seated in a back booth when Lena arrived, a cup of espresso in front of him and a menu he wasn't reading. "Sit," he said quietly. "Order something. We're just two people having lunch." Lena ordered coffee she didn't want and pasta she was too nervous to eat. Once the waiter left, she pulled out the encrypted drive and slid it across the table. "Expense reports from a Brooklyn construction project," she said, keeping her voice low. "The numbers don't make sense. Inflated costs, suspicious vendor patterns, exactly what you described." Marco pocketed the drive without looking at it. "How did you access this?" "Patricia asked me to scan and file them. Standard administrative task." "And no one saw you photograph them?" "The office was empty. I was careful." Marco's expression remained neutral, but Lena thought she saw a flicker of approval. "Good. I'll analyze these, see if the patterns hold up to closer scrutiny. But this is exactly the kind of evidence we need, financial documentation that shows the real transactions hiding behind legitimate expenses." It's not enough, though, is it?" Lena asked. "Not to really bring them down?" "No, we need more. We need documentation that ties these transactions to specific illegal activities. We need communications that explicitly discuss the money laundering. We need proof of Reyes's personal involvement." Marco took a sip of his espresso. "What you found is a beginning, but it's only a beginning." The food arrived, providing a natural break in the conversation. They ate in silence for a few minutes, just two people sharing a meal, nothing suspicious or unusual. But underneath the normalcy, Lena's mind was racing with possibilities and dangers. I need to get closer to Reyes, she said finally. Patricia shields him from administrative staff. As long as I'm just her assistant, I won't have access to the real operations. Getting closer to Reyes means increasing your exposure, Marco countered. It means more scrutiny, more chances to make a mistake that gets you identified. It's also the only way to get the evidence we need. Lena met his eyes across the table. You said yourself we need proof of his personal involvement. I can't get that from the periphery. Marco was silent for a long moment, studying her face as if weighing her resolve against the risks. There are ways to make yourself valuable to an organization, he said carefully. Ways to become someone they trust with more responsibility. But it requires you to compromise, to participate in activities that cross ethical lines. I'm already working for a criminal organization, Lena pointed out. That line has been crossed. There's a difference between filing expense reports and actively participating in illegal activities. Once you cross that second line, you become complicit in ways that can't be undone. Marco's expression was grave. I need you to understand that before you commit to getting closer. Some stains don't wash off. Lena thought of her parents, of the casual brutality with which they'd been eliminated, of 19 years of lies and secrets. She thought of Victor Reyes living free and powerful, while David and Susan Carter moldered in graves they should have had decades more life to avoid. I understand, she said, and I'm still willing. Marco nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this answer, but hoped for something different. Then we make you valuable. We create an opportunity for you to prove yourself in ways that earn you more access. But it has to happen organically, nothing that seems manufactured or suspicious. How? I'll create a situation, a problem that needs solving, something that seems like random bad luck but requires someone with initiative to handle. You solve it efficiently, demonstrate discretion and capability, and suddenly you're someone worth trusting with bigger responsibilities. The manipulation of it all should have bothered Lena more than it did. But she'd learned in the past weeks that fighting a criminal organization required thinking like one. Strategic, calculating, willing to create advantageous situations through careful orchestration. When? She asked. Soon. I need to study these expense reports first, understand the full scope of the Brooklyn operation. Once I know what we're dealing with, I'll know where to create pressure. Marco finished his espresso and signaled for the check. In the meantime, continue being perfect, Elena Morse. Reliable, competent, forgettable. The opportunity will come. They parted on the street outside the restaurant, two strangers who'd shared a meal and nothing more. Lena took the subway back to Manhattan, her mind already spinning with possibilities and plans. The opportunity Marco promised came 10 days later in the form of a crisis that seemed entirely natural. Lena was at her desk on a Tuesday morning when Patricia burst from her office, phone pressed to her ear, her normally controlled demeanor cracking into visible stress. I don't care what the contractor says. The inspection is tomorrow, and the permits aren't filed properly, Patricia was saying. She ended the call and looked around the office with obvious frustration. Elena, my office, now! Lena grabbed her tablet and followed, closing the door behind her. Patricia was pacing, running a hand through her hair in a gesture of pure agitation. The Brooklyn project is a disaster, Patricia said bluntly. We have a city inspection scheduled for tomorrow morning, but the contractor filed the wrong permits. The correct permits take 72 hours to process through normal channels, which means we either delay the inspection, which makes us look incompetent and triggers questions we don't want asked, or we find someone who can expedite the permits through unofficial channels. Lena's pulse quickened. This was it. The opportunity Marco had engineered. What do you need me to do? Patricia stopped pacing and looked at Lena directly. I need someone who can go to the city offices, find the right person to talk to, and make this problem go away. Someone who won't ask questions about why this is so urgent or how much we're willing to pay to expedite things. Someone I can trust to be discreet. The test was obvious. Patricia was asking Lena to participate in bribery, to engage directly in the kind of corruption that kept the criminal operation functioning. Refusing would mark her as unreliable, useless for anything beyond basic administrative work. Accepting would open doors to deeper involvement. Lena made her decision in the space of a heartbeat. I can handle it. Just tell me who to talk to and what we need. Relief flooded Patricia's face. There's a clerk at the Department of Buildings, third floor, window 12. His name is Michael Santos. Tell him you're there about the Brooklyn permits for Meridian Development and that Patricia sent you. He'll know what that means. What if he asks questions? He won't. He's done this before. Patricia opened her desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. This covers the expediting fee. Don't count it. Don't ask about it. Just give it to him when he provides the corrected permits. Clear? Lena took the envelope. It was thick enough to suggest thousands of dollars. Crystal clear. Good. Go now. We need those permits by end of business today. Patricia's expression softened slightly. I know this isn't exactly standard administrative work, but people who solve problems without creating drama, they're valuable to this company. Very valuable. The implication was clear. Pass this test, and doors would open. Fail, and she'd remain a peripheral employee with no real access. Lena grabbed her coat and bag and headed for the Department of Buildings. The manila envelope felt heavy in her messenger bag, weighted with more than just cash. This was her crossing a line she couldn't uncross, actively participating in the corruption that enabled the criminal operation. Her father would have refused. He'd believed in the system, in doing things the right way even when it was dangerous. That belief had gotten him killed. Lena had learned a different lesson from his death. The Department of Buildings was exactly as depressing as she'd expected. Fluorescent lighting, worn linoleum, the particular smell of government bureaucracy slowly grinding through endless paperwork. Lena found the third floor and located window 12, where a bored-looking man in his 40s was processing forms with the enthusiasm of someone counting the minutes until retirement. Michael Santos? Lena asked quietly. He looked up, assessed her with experienced eyes. Depends on who's asking. I'm here about the Brooklyn permits for Meridian Development. Patricia Chen sent me. Something shifted in his expression. He glanced around, noted the security cameras positioned throughout the office, then pulled out a form and slid it across the counter. Fill this out. Complete information, no mistakes. Lena filled out the form. A standard permit correction request that under normal circumstances would take days to process. When she finished, Michael reviewed it briefly, then stood. Wait here, he said, disappearing into a back office. 15 minutes later, he returned with corrected permits, properly filed and stamped with the necessary approvals. He slid them across the counter along with the form Lena had filled out, which now had an official processing number that would make everything look legitimate. Processing fee is $2,000, Michael said in a bored tone that suggested this was a completely normal transaction. Lena pulled the envelope from her bag and slid it across the counter. Michael palmed it without looking inside, the motion so practiced it was almost elegant. The envelope disappeared into his pocket, and suddenly they were just a clerk helping a citizen with routine paperwork. Have a nice day, Michael said, already turning to his next customer. Lena left the building with the corrected permits and the sick knowledge that she'd just participated in exactly the kind of corruption that allowed criminal organizations to operate with impunity. City officials taking bribes, permits expedited through unofficial channels, systems designed to protect the public being subverted for profit. This was how it worked. This was the machinery that had protected her parents' murderers for 19 years. She delivered the permits to Patricia, who reviewed them with obvious relief. Perfect, Patricia said. Exactly what we needed. You handled this beautifully, Elena. Happy to help, Lena said, channeling Elena Morse's pleasant competence. I mean it. This is the kind of problem-solving we value. People who understand that sometimes solutions require flexibility. Patricia filed the permits and looked at Lena with new assessment. How would you feel about taking on some additional responsibilities? More varied work, higher-level support, possibly some direct interaction with Mr. Reyes? There it was, the door opening exactly as Marco had predicted. I'd welcome the opportunity, Lena said carefully. I want to contribute however I can. Good. We'll start transitioning you into more strategic projects. You'll need to sign an updated confidentiality agreement. Stricter terms, higher stakes. Can you handle that? Absolutely. Patricia smiled, the expression holding approval and something that might have been respect. Welcome to the real Meridian Development, Elena. I think you're going to do very well here. Lena returned to her desk, feeling like she'd won a battle and lost part of her soul simultaneously. She'd gained access, proven herself valuable, opened the door to deeper involvement in the operation. But she'd done it by becoming complicit in the very corruption she'd come to expose. That night, she met Marco at a different location, a parking garage in Queens where they could talk without surveillance. Patricia offered me expanded responsibilities, Lena reported. Direct access to higher-level projects, possibly direct interaction with Reyes. The bribery worked then, Marco said. It wasn't a question. It worked exactly as you designed it to work. Lena couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. I just participated in the same corrupt system that protected my parents' killers. Yes, you did. And I'm sorry I put you in that position, but there was no other way to gain the access we need. Marco's expression was sympathetic but unflinching. This is what fighting from inside looks like. It's ugly and morally complicated, and it requires you to become what you're fighting against, at least temporarily. How do you live with it? Lena asked. The compromises, the corruption, the moral weight of it all? I remind myself why I'm doing it. I remember the people who matter, the debts that can never be fully repaid, the justice that won't come any other way. Marco met her eyes in the dim garage lighting, and I accept that I'm not a good person, that I've made choices that can't be undone. The question is whether you can accept the same thing. Lena thought about that for a long moment. Could she accept becoming someone who bribed government officials, who participated in corruption, who crossed ethical lines in pursuit of a goal that felt increasingly complicated? Could she live with the person she was becoming in order to honor the people her parents had been? I can accept it if it brings them down, she said finally. If this corruption and compromise leads to Victor Reyes and his organization being exposed and destroyed, then I can live with what I had to become to make it happen. Good, because the real work is about to begin. Marco pulled out a folder, physical documents, nothing digital that could be traced. The expense reports you photographed showed patterns of money laundering through the Brooklyn construction project. But there are 3 other projects running simultaneously, one in Queens, one in the Bronx, one in New Jersey. If we can document that the pattern exists across all of them, we can prove this isn't isolated fraud but systematic money laundering. How do I access information about the other projects? Your expanded role will give you broader access to company files. The key is knowing what to look for and how to extract it without triggering attention. Marco opened the folder, revealing photographs and documents. These are the project names, the managers involved, the companies that should appear in expense reports. If you can document the same inflated costs, the same suspicious vendor patterns across all 4 projects, we'll have proof of the full scope. Lena studied the information, memorizing details. How much time do we have? As much as we can get. But be aware, the longer you're inside, the more chances you have to make a mistake. And the deeper you get involved, the harder it becomes to maintain the separation between Elena Morse and Lana Carter. Marco's voice carried warning. People who work for criminals long enough start thinking like criminals. They rationalize, they compromise, they tell themselves the ends justify the means until they can't remember what their original ends were. That won't happen to me, Lena said with more confidence than she felt. That's what everyone says. Just remember who you are and why you're doing this. Remember your parents. Remember the truth you're trying to expose. Remember that you're not actually Elena Morse, no matter how convincing the performance becomes. The warning stayed with Lena over the following weeks as her role at Meridian Development expanded. Patricia introduced her to the senior staff, gave her access to broader company files, included her in meetings where decisions about the various construction projects were discussed in language carefully calibrated to sound legitimate while discussing illegal operations. Lena learned to speak that language. She learned to participate in conversations about budget flexibility and vendor relationships and expedited processes without flinching at what those euphemisms really meant. She learned to smile and nod when Patricia or other executives made casual references to activities that were clearly criminal. And slowly, carefully, she documented it all. She photographed expense reports from the Queens project showing the same inflated costs. She memorized names mentioned in meetings, vendors who were clearly fronts, officials who were obviously corrupt, the whole network of people who made the money laundering possible. She observed the patterns of behavior, noted who made decisions, identified the hierarchy of power that ran the operation. Most importantly, she started having brief interactions with Victor Reyes himself. The first time was in an elevator, a chance encounter that lasted maybe 30 seconds. Reyes was exactly as he'd appeared in the photographs Marco had shown her, distinguished, well-dressed, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. He smiled politely at Lena, made a brief comment about the weather, and exited on the executive floor. Nothing remarkable, just a boss being pleasant to an employee. But Lena's hands had shaken for an hour afterward. This was him. This was the man who ran the organization that had murdered her parents. Standing 3 feet away, smiling blandly, completely unaware that David Carter's daughter was working in his office, gathering evidence that would destroy him. The second interaction came during a meeting about the New Jersey project. Patricia had asked Lena to take notes, and Reyes had been leading the discussion. He'd acknowledged her presence with a nod, asked her to note specific items, treated her with the same professional courtesy he'd show any competent assistant. Lena had typed notes with steady hands, documented every word while sitting across the table from her parents' killer, and maintained Elena Morse's pleasant competence without a single crack in the performance. Afterward, Patricia had complimented her composure. "You handled that well. Some people get nervous around Mr. Reyes. He appreciates employees who can stay calm and professional." "He seems easy to work with," Lena had responded, the lie smooth as silk. But that night, alone in her apartment, Lena had stood in the shower and cried with a rage so pure it felt cleansing. She'd been in the same room with Victor Reyes. She'd taken notes for him, followed his instructions, acted as if he were just a normal boss instead of a murderer who'd ordered her parents executed. The performance was eating her alive. Riley noticed, of course. "You're different," she said one Sunday morning over coffee that had become their weekly ritual. "Harder, more controlled. Sometimes I look at you and I don't recognize the person looking back." "I'm fine," Lena said automatically. "That's what concerns me. You should not be fine. You should be terrified or angry or conflicted about what you're doing, but instead you're just controlled, like you've shut down everything except the mission." Lena wanted to deny it, but Riley deserved honesty. "I can't afford emotions right now. If I let myself feel everything I'm feeling, the rage, the fear, the moral compromise, I'll fall apart. So I'm compartmentalizing. I'm being Elena Morse completely when I need to be, and I'm setting Lena Carter aside until this is finished." "And what if you can't get Lena Carter back?" Riley asked quietly. "What if you've become Elena Morse so thoroughly that you forget who you really are?" The question haunted Lena because she didn't have an answer. Marco had warned about exactly this, the danger of maintaining a cover identity so completely that it stopped being a cover and became who you actually were. But what choice did she have? Breaking character meant breaking her cover, and breaking her cover meant death. So she stayed in character. She became better at being Elena Morse than she'd ever been at being Lena Carter, and she tried not to think about what that transformation was costing her. By the end of her second month at Meridian Development, Lena had documented evidence of systematic money laundering across all 4 construction projects. She'd photographed hundreds of pages of financial records, memorized dozens of names and relationships, built a comprehensive picture of how the operation functioned. But she still didn't have the one thing Marco insisted they needed: direct proof of Victor Reyes' personal involvement. Everything she'd found could theoretically be blamed on subordinates acting without his knowledge. To truly destroy him, they needed evidence that he knew about and actively directed the illegal operations. "We're close," Marco said during one of their carefully scheduled meetings. "But close isn't enough. We need something that ties Reyes directly to criminal activity, communications, direct orders, personal involvement in decisions that are obviously illegal." "How am I supposed to get that?" Lena asked. "He's careful. Everything goes through layers of people. He never puts anything explicit in writing." "Then we need to create a situation where he has no choice but to be explicit, where the careful distance he maintains becomes impossible." Before Lena could ask what that meant, Marco's phone buzzed. He checked it, and his expression went cold. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "The surveillance on you has intensified. Multiple teams, more aggressive tactics. Someone is very interested in Elena Morse." Lena's stomach dropped. "Reyes?" "Possibly. Or someone else who's noticed patterns in your behavior. Either way, we're running out of time. Marco's expression was grim. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it soon, before they figure out who you really are. The warning about intensified surveillance changed everything. Lena felt it immediately, the weight of eyes she couldn't see, the sense of being tracked even in supposedly safe moments. Marco's people identified at least 3 different teams rotating through her daily routine, professional enough to avoid obvious detection, but persistent enough to suggest serious interest. "They're trying to figure out who you really are," Marco said during an emergency meeting in a safe house in Red Hook. "Which means either Reyes suspects something or someone else has connected dots we didn't anticipate." "How long before they identify me as David Carter's daughter?" Lena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "Days, maybe a week if we're lucky. Elena Morse's identity is solid, but if they dig deep enough, if they run facial recognition against old photos, if they start looking at genealogy databases, they'll find the connection." Marco's expression was grave. "We need to move now. Force the confrontation before they're ready for it." "How?" Marco pulled out a folder containing documents Lena recognized from her work at Meridian. "The New Jersey project is the biggest money laundering operation they're running. $50 million in dirty money moving through construction costs over the next 6 months. Reyes is personally invested. It's his deal, his connections, his profit. If something goes wrong with that project, he'll have to get involved directly." "You want to sabotage it," Lena said slowly. "I want to create a crisis that forces Reyes to expose himself. The kind of emergency where he can't maintain careful distance, where he has to communicate directly about illegal activities." Marco met her eyes. "But it's dangerous. We'll be painting a target on your back and hoping we can use the chaos to extract evidence before they figure out what's happening." Lena thought of her parents, of 19 years waiting for justice, of the photographs and documents she'd gathered that proved the scope of the operation, but not Reyes's direct culpability. They were so close. Walking away now would mean everything she'd risked, everything she'd compromised, had been for nothing. "Tell me the plan," she said. Marco laid it out with the precision of someone who'd orchestrated dozens of similar operations. He would use his connections to trigger a federal investigation into the New Jersey project. Not a full raid, just enough scrutiny to make the local officials Reyes had bribed nervous. Nervous officials meant unreliable partners, which meant Reyes would have to intervene personally to keep the operation running. When he intervenes, he'll have to communicate about the real nature of the project. We need you positioned to intercept those communications, emails, phone calls, direct conversations, something explicit enough that he can't deny knowledge or claim it was subordinates acting independently. "What about the surveillance?" Lena asked. "If they're already suspicious, won't this just confirm their concerns?" "That's the risk. We're accelerating the timeline before we're fully ready because we're out of options. Either we force the confrontation now, on our terms, or we wait for them to identify you and eliminate the threat." Marco's voice was steady, but his eyes held worry. "I won't lie to you, Lena. This could go very wrong very quickly. If you want to extract now, disappear before they make the connection, I can make that happen. You'll be safe." "But Reyes will stay free," Lena said. "Yes, he'll stay free, and the organization will continue, and your parents' murder will remain unavenged." Lena looked at the documents spread across the table. Evidence of systematic corruption, of lives destroyed by greed, of a criminal empire that had operated with impunity for decades. She thought of her 7-year-old self on that swing, innocent and unaware of the violence that would soon shatter her world. She thought of her father choosing courage over safety, her mother supporting that choice, both of them dying because they'd believed justice mattered more than survival. "We go forward," Lena said. "We force the confrontation." Marco nodded as if he'd expected this answer. "Then we move fast. I'll trigger the federal interest tomorrow. By end of week, Reyes will be scrambling to protect the New Jersey project. Your job is to position yourself to intercept his communications without making it obvious you're looking." The next 3 days were a masterclass in controlled chaos. Marco's connections triggered exactly the kind of federal scrutiny he'd promised. Not a raid, but pointed questions to the officials Reyes had bribed, requests for documentation that suggested deeper investigation might be coming. Lena watched the panic ripple through Meridian development in real time. Patricia was on her phone constantly, her normally controlled demeanor cracking into visible stress. Senior staff held emergency meetings behind closed doors. The casual atmosphere that usually pervaded the office evaporated, replaced by the kind of tension that came when people who'd built their lives on corruption suddenly faced consequences. And through it all, Lena maintained Elena Morse's pleasant competence, offering to help wherever needed, making herself useful in the crisis without appearing too eager or too curious. The opportunity came on Thursday afternoon. Patricia called Lena into her office, where Victor Reyes himself stood by the window, his distinguished facade showing cracks of genuine concern. "Elena," Patricia said, "we need someone we can trust to coordinate communications between our legal team and the New Jersey site managers. Someone discreet who understands the sensitivity of the situation." Reyes turned from the window, his sharp eyes assessing Lena with new attention. "Patricia tells me you've proven yourself reliable, capable of handling delicate matters without unnecessary questions." "I try to be helpful," Lena said, channeling Elena's careful neutrality. "This situation in New Jersey is a misunderstanding," Reyes continued, his tone suggesting he was choosing words carefully. "Federal regulators sometimes get confused about standard construction practices. We need to coordinate our response, make sure everyone is providing consistent information. Can you handle that level of coordination?" It was a test and an offer simultaneously. Agree, and she'd have access to the exact communications Marco said they needed. Refuse, and she'd mark herself as unreliable at the worst possible moment. "Of course," Lena said. "Whatever you need." Reyes smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "Good. Patricia will give you the details. Remember, discretion is everything. We take care of people who understand that." He left the office, and Patricia immediately began explaining Lena's new responsibilities. She would be the central coordinator for all communications between Reyes, the legal team, the site managers, and the officials they'd bribed in New Jersey. Every email, every phone call, every message would flow through her. It was exactly what they needed. It was also almost certainly a trap. That night, Lena met Marco in the safe house, her hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. "He's testing me," she said, "giving me access to everything, watching to see what I do with it." "Of course he is. Reyes didn't survive this long by trusting easily." Marco paced the small room, his mind clearly racing through scenarios. "The question is whether this is standard security protocol or whether he already suspects you specifically. Either way, I'm positioned exactly where we need me to be. I'll have access to all the communications about the New Jersey project, including whatever Reyes says directly about the illegal aspects. And if it's a trap, they'll be watching every move you make, waiting for you to expose yourself." Marco stopped pacing and faced her directly. "We need to plan for both possibilities. You gather the evidence, but we also prepare for immediate extraction the moment anything goes wrong." They spent hours planning contingencies, safe houses Lena could reach quickly, emergency contacts who could help if Marco himself was compromised, multiple escape routes out of the city if everything fell apart. It felt like preparing for war, which Lena supposed they were. The next morning, Lena arrived at the office early and found her desk equipped with a new computer, new phone, new access credentials that gave her visibility into communications she'd never been allowed to see before. The trust was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. The first email arrived before 9 a.m. It was from Reyes to the legal team, marked confidential, discussing the federal inquiry in language that was careful but not quite careful enough. He referenced alternative payment structures that needed to be properly documented to avoid misunderstanding about relationships with local officials. Lena read it 3 times, her photographer's eye catching the spaces between words where the real meaning lived. This was Reyes acknowledging the bribes, instructing his team to create documentation that would make the corruption look legitimate. She forwarded it to the appropriate recipients as instructed, but not before photographing it with her personal phone, the one she kept hidden in her bag. Over the next 2 days, the communications became more explicit. Reyes was coordinating a cover-up in real time, and Lena had a front-row seat to every instruction, every barely coded reference to illegal activities, every moment where his careful distance collapsed under the pressure of protecting his operation. She documented everything, every email, every phone call she coordinated, every instruction that proved Reyes not only knew about the money laundering, but actively directed it. The evidence accumulated like ammunition, each piece building toward irrefutable proof of his guilt. But the surveillance was intensifying too. Lena felt it constantly now, the weight of being watched, the sense that every move was being analyzed. She spotted the same faces near her apartment, outside the office, on the subway. They weren't even trying to hide anymore, which suggested they were either supremely confident or preparing to move. On the 5th day after taking on the coordination role, Lena received a message from Patricia asking her to come to Reyes's private office. It was the first time she'd been summoned there directly, and every instinct screamed warning. She sent Marco the emergency signal, a red exclamation mark, before walking to the executive floor. Reyes's office was exactly what she'd expected: expensive, understated, designed to project power without vulgarity. He sat behind a massive desk, and standing beside him was a man Lena didn't recognize. Tall, muscular, with the kind of stillness that suggested violence held carefully in check. "Elena," Reyes said pleasantly, "thank you for coming. This is Marcus Webb. He handles security for our organization." The word organization instead of company made Lena's skin prickle. They were dropping pretenses. "Please, sit," Reyes continued, gesturing to a chair positioned directly across from his desk. Lena sat, her mind racing through options. The door was behind her. Marcus Webb stood between her and the only exit. If this went wrong, she had maybe seconds to react. "You've been very helpful these past few days," Reyes said, his tone conversational, "coordinating our response to the New Jersey situation with impressive efficiency. Patricia was right to recommend you for expanded responsibilities." "I'm glad I could help," Lena said, maintaining Elena's pleasant demeanor despite her hammering heart. "I'm curious about something, though." Reyes leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're very good at your job. Almost too good for someone with your employment history. Most administrative assistants with your resume wouldn't handle this level of coordination with such composure." The accusation was subtle, but unmistakable. Lena forced herself to meet his gaze calmly. "I've always believed in exceeding expectations. It's how you build a career." "Indeed." Reyes pulled out a folder and opened it, revealing photographs Lena recognized with sinking dread. They were surveillance photos, but not of Elena Morse. They were of Lena Carter, at her real apartment with Riley, at photography gigs she'd worked before creating her cover identity. "The interesting thing about building careers," Reyes continued, "is that they require authentic histories, real references, genuine experience, verifiable backgrounds." He slid one photo across the desk. It showed Lena at a gallery opening 6 months ago, her real name on the event credentials hanging around her neck. Elena Morse has an impressive resume. Lena Carter, on the other hand, has a very different history, one that includes being orphaned in 2005 when her parents died in what police called an accident. The room felt airless. Lena's mind raced through responses, denials, explanations that might salvage the situation. But looking at Reyes's cold expression, she knew the time for pretense was over. "When did you know?" she asked quietly, abandoning Elena's voice for her own. "We started suspecting about 2 weeks ago when our surveillance noted inconsistencies in your behavior. The confirmation came 3 days ago when we ran comprehensive facial recognition." Reyes's expression held something like professional respect. "The identity was excellent, by the way. If we hadn't been specifically looking, we might never have made the connection. But once we started digging, the pieces fell into place. David Carter's daughter working in my office, gathering evidence. It's almost elegant." Lena's hand moved toward her bag, but Marcus Webb was faster. He grabbed her wrist with crushing force, removed her phone, her keys, the small canister of pepper spray Riley had insisted she carry. "The question," Reyes continued calmly, "is what to do about you. The obvious solution is to eliminate the problem. You've seen too much, documented too much, become too much of a liability." He paused, studying her face. "But I'm curious about something first. Who are you working with? The FBI? A rival organization? Someone with a personal grudge against our operations?" Lena said nothing. Giving up Marco would accomplish nothing except getting them both killed. Reyes sighed. I respect loyalty, truly. But it's misplaced in this situation. You're going to tell me everything, who you're working with, what evidence you've gathered, who else knows about your investigation. The question is whether you tell me voluntarily or whether Marcus has to persuade you. The threat was clear. Lena looked at Marcus Webb's cold expression and knew exactly what kind of persuasion Reyes meant. She thought of her parents, of the violence that had killed them, of 19 years spent not knowing the truth. She thought of Marco carrying her childhood photograph as penance for a failure he couldn't undo. She thought of the evidence she'd gathered, the communications she'd documented, the proof of Reyes's crimes that existed in encrypted files he didn't know about. "My father tried to expose you," Lena said, her voice steady despite her terror. 20 years ago, he found the patterns in your money laundering and tried to bring you to justice. You killed him for it, murdered him and my mother, and made it look like an accident. "I didn't personally kill anyone," Reyes corrected. "Though yes, the organization I now run made that decision. Your father was a liability. These things happen in business." The casual dismissal of her parents' murder sparked rage so pure it burned through Lena's fear. They were good people. They had a daughter. They deserved to live. They chose to interfere with operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That choice had consequences. Reyes stood and walked to the window, looking out over Manhattan as if discussing nothing more significant than weather. "Just as your choice to infiltrate my organization has consequences. The difference is that you're here, alive, with a chance to minimize those consequences by cooperating." "You're going to kill me anyway," Lena said, "whether I cooperate or not. Why would I give you anything?" "Because the alternative is hours of pain before death. Because I can make it quick and clean instead of prolonged and agonizing. Because—" Reyes turned back to face her. "There might be a very narrow path where you survive this. If the evidence you've gathered hasn't been distributed yet, if you're working alone, if you're willing to disappear completely and never surface again, there's a possibility I let you walk away." It was a lie. Lena could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice. Reyes hadn't survived this long by leaving loose ends alive. But he was offering hope because desperate people made mistakes, revealed information they'd otherwise protect. Before Lena could respond, the building's fire alarm erupted into shrieking life. Marcus Webb immediately moved to the door, checking the hallway. "Sir, we need to evacuate. Protocol requires—" The window behind Reyes's desk exploded inward in a shower of glass. Everything happened in seconds. Armed men in tactical gear poured through the window on rappelling lines, weapons raised, shouting commands that got lost in the chaos of the alarm and breaking glass. Marcus Webb drew a gun but was tackled before he could fire. Reyes dove for his desk but was intercepted mid-motion, slammed against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. And through the broken window, Marco Valenti climbed into the office with the casual grace of someone who'd done this before. "I got your signal," he said to Lena, helping her up from the chair where she'd frozen in shock. "Thought you might need backup." The extraction team secured the room with military precision. Reyes was zip-tied and forced to his knees, his distinguished facade shattered by genuine fear. Marcus Webb was similarly restrained, blood running from a cut above his eye. "What?" Lena started, her mind struggling to process the sudden reversal. "Change of plans," Marco said tersely. He pulled out her confiscated phone and handed it back. "The communications you documented over the past week were perfect. Everything we needed to prove Reyes's direct involvement. But when I got your emergency signal, I decided we couldn't wait for the slow play. So we're doing this the fast way." "What fast way?" Marco smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. "We're making him confess. On camera. With evidence so overwhelming that even his corrupted officials can't make it disappear." One of the tactical teams set up a camera on a tripod, professional equipment that suggested this had been planned in advance. Marco dragged Reyes in front of it, forcing him into a chair. "Victor Reyes," Marco said formally, "you're going to tell this camera everything, the money laundering operations, the bribes, the murders you've ordered, every crime you've committed in the last 20 years. Reyes laughed, the sound harsh with contempt. "You think I'll confess because you broke into my office? I have lawyers, connections, power you can't imagine. Whatever you think you're doing here, it won't work." "Really?" Marco pulled out a tablet and opened files Lena recognized. The communications she'd documented, the financial records she'd photographed, the comprehensive evidence they'd been building for months. Because I have proof of systematic money laundering across 4 construction projects. I have emails where you explicitly discuss bribing officials. I have phone records that tie you directly to criminal operations. And if you don't confess on camera right now, all of this goes to every media outlet in New York simultaneously. Reyes's expression darkened. You release that? You'll spend the rest of your life in prison. You've broken into my office, assaulted my employees, stolen confidential documents. I'll destroy you. Maybe, Marco agreed, but you'll be destroyed first. And more importantly, he gestured to Lena, she'll be safe. Because once this evidence is public, killing her becomes pointless. The damage is already done. The calculation was clear in Reyes's eyes. He was weighing options, looking for angles, trying to find a way out that didn't exist. The fire alarm continued shrieking, providing cover for the confrontation, buying them time before building security or police arrived. You have 60 seconds to decide, Marco said. Confess on camera, provide details that corroborate the evidence we already have, and maybe you survive long enough for a trial. Refuse and I release everything right now. Your choice. Reyes looked at the camera, at Marco, at Lena standing behind them. She saw the moment he recognized her, really recognized her, not just as the infiltrator Lena Morse, but as David Carter's daughter, the 7-year-old orphan he'd created with his orders. You look like her, Reyes said quietly. Your mother. She begged, you know. When they came for them, she begged them to think about their daughter. The words hit Lena like physical blows. She'd imagined her parents' final moments countless times, but hearing it confirmed, hearing that her mother had begged, had thought of her daughter in those last terrible seconds, made everything real in a way it had never been before. 30 seconds, Marco said, his voice hard. Reyes turned to the camera, and he started talking. The confession took 20 minutes. He detailed the money laundering operations, named the officials he'd bribed, admitted to ordering deaths, including Lena's parents. He spoke with the defeated tone of someone who'd run out of options, who understood that power was an illusion that collapsed when the right pressure was applied in the right places. Lena watched it happen in a daze. This was it. This was the justice she'd spent months fighting for, the truth her parents had died trying to expose. And it was happening in a broken office with alarms shrieking and armed men holding a criminal at gunpoint while he confessed to decades of crimes. When Reyes finished, Marco saved the video file and immediately uploaded it to multiple locations. Encrypted servers, secure clouds, backup systems that would preserve the confession even if the original was destroyed. The evidence and confession are now being delivered to the FBI, the Attorney General's office, and 5 major media outlets, Marco said, checking his phone. In approximately 10 minutes, every law enforcement agency in New York will be converging on this location. I suggest we not be here when they arrive. His team moved with practiced efficiency, gathering equipment, preparing to extract. Marco grabbed Lena's arm, pulling her toward the broken window and the rappelling lines that would carry them down the outside of the building. Wait, Lena said, pulling back. She walked to where Reyes sat, defeated and restrained, the man who'd murdered her parents looking suddenly small and pathetic. I hope you live, Lena said quietly. I hope you survive to stand trial, to see everything you built dismantled piece by piece. I hope you spend whatever years you have left in a cell, knowing that you lost to the daughter of people you thought you'd silenced forever. Reyes looked up at her, and for just a moment, something like respect flickered in his eyes. Your father would be proud, he said. Foolish, but proud. My father was brave, Lena corrected. Braver than you'll ever understand. Marco pulled her away, securing her to a rappelling line. Time to go. Now! They descended the outside of the building as sirens began converging on the location. The extraction team disappeared into vehicles positioned strategically around the block, scattering in different directions to avoid coordinated pursuit. Marco hustled Lena into a nondescript sedan, and they drove through Manhattan streets while behind them, chaos erupted around Meridian Development. The news broke within the hour. Victor Reyes arrested on money laundering and murder charges. Video confession leaked to media showing systematic corruption spanning 2 decades. Federal investigation launched into the entire organization, officials scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. Lena watched it unfold from the safe house in Red Hook, Marco beside her, both of them exhausted and running on adrenaline fumes. "It's done," Marco said quietly. "Your parents' murder is exposed. Reyes will spend the rest of his life in prison. The organization is finished." "It's done," Lena echoed, but she felt strangely hollow. She'd imagined this moment for months, but the reality was less triumphant than she'd expected. Justice had come, but it couldn't undo the damage. It couldn't bring her parents back or restore the childhood that had been stolen from her. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you disappear for a while. Let the investigation run its course without you becoming a target for whatever remains of Reyes's organization. I have resources, new identity, relocation, financial support. You can start over somewhere safe." Lena thought about that. Another new identity, another fresh start, another attempt to build a life from the ashes of violence. It sounded exhausting. "I don't want to run anymore," she said. "I don't want to be someone else or hide from threats that might never materialize. I want my life back, my real life, in my real name, in the city I've lived in for years." "That's dangerous," Marco warned. "Even with Reyes arrested, there are people who might seek revenge. You'll need protection, at least initially." "Then protect me. But let me be Lena Carter. Let me reclaim the identity I spent months pretending wasn't mine." Marco studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. But we do it carefully. Security protocols, safe procedures, constant awareness. Agreed?" "Agreed." The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, media attention, and the slow dismantling of the Castillo organization. Lena gave testimony to federal prosecutors, her identity protected, but her role in exposing the operation acknowledged. The evidence she'd gathered became central to the case against not just Reyes, but dozens of officials and business people who'd participated in the corruption. Riley cried when Lena finally told her the whole story, anger and relief and fear mixing into an emotional storm that took hours to subside. "You almost died," Riley kept repeating. "You almost died, and I wouldn't have even known why." "But I didn't die," Lena said, holding her friend. "I survived, and I finished what my parents started." The media coverage was intense but surprisingly sympathetic. The narrative of an orphaned daughter exposing her parents' murderers resonated in ways that made Lena uncomfortable. She didn't want to be a symbol or inspiration, just someone who demanded truth in a world that preferred comfortable lies. Marco maintained his promise of protection, his people providing discreet security that Lena barely noticed but appreciated nonetheless. He visited occasionally, checking on her welfare, ensuring she had everything she needed. "You could work for me," he offered during one visit. "Your skills at infiltration and investigation are exceptional. I could use someone with your talents." Lena smiled but shook her head. "I'm done with that world. I want to go back to photography, to creating things instead of destroying them. I want a normal life." "After everything you've experienced, you think normal is possible?" "I think I have to try. My parents didn't die so I could become someone who lives in shadows and violence. They died believing in justice and truth, and doing the right thing even when it's hard. I want to honor that by building something good from what they left me." Marco nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then do that. Build something good. And know that if you ever need help, I'm here. Some debts transcend lifetimes." 6 months after Reyes's arrest, Lena stood in a Manhattan gallery where her photography was being exhibited. The collection was called Evidence, images from her investigation, abstracted and transformed into art that explored themes of truth, justice, and the price of both. She documented her own journey without compromising the legal case, creating something beautiful from the darkness she'd inhabited. Riley stood beside her, proud and emotional. "Your parents would love this," she said quietly. "I hope so," Lena replied. The gallery filled with people, critics, collectors, other photographers. But Lena found herself drawn to a corner where a single image hung, the photograph of her 7-year-old self on the swing, the one that had started everything. She'd included it as the centerpiece of the exhibition, a reminder of innocence and the violence that shattered it. As she stood there, a man approached, distinguished, well-dressed, carrying himself with the kind of casual authority that suggested someone comfortable with power. "Beautiful work," he said, studying the photograph. The way you've captured the intersection of childhood and loss is remarkable. Thank you, Lena said automatically, then looked at him more closely. There was something familiar about him, something that triggered recognition she couldn't quite place. The man smiled. You don't remember me. We met once, very briefly, at a charity gala months ago. I dropped my wallet and you returned it. Memory crashed over Lena like a wave. This was how it had started. A dropped wallet, a found photograph, a truth that couldn't be ignored once discovered. She'd come full circle, standing in a gallery built from the evidence she'd gathered, confronting the very moment that had changed everything. I remember, she said quietly. I'm glad your story ended well, the man said. Not all stories do, especially when they involve the kind of darkness you explored. Your parents would be proud of what you've accomplished. He moved away into the crowd, leaving Lena standing alone with her photograph and her memories. She thought of her father's courage, her mother's love, Antonio Valenti's sacrifice, Marco's decades of penance. She thought of the person she'd become in pursuit of truth, harder, more cynical, marked by compromises and moral complexity she could never fully escape. But she'd survived, and she'd transformed the pain into purpose, the evidence of crime into art, the darkness into something that held meaning beyond just vengeance. Lena touched the frame of the photograph gently, a gesture that might have been goodbye or might have been promise. 7-year-old Lena smiled back at her from that captured moment, forever innocent, forever unaware of what was coming. I finished it, Lena whispered. I found the truth and made them pay. I hope that's enough. The gallery buzzed with life around her, people appreciating art, discussing technique, living their normal lives. Lena stood among them, no longer hiding, no longer pretending to be someone else. Just Lena Carter, photographer and orphan and survivor, building something good from the ashes of violence. Her parents had believed in justice. They'd died for that belief, but they'd also lived by it. And now, finally, their daughter could too. The exhibition ran for 3 months and launched Lena's career in ways she hadn't anticipated. Critics praised her work. Collectors bought her pieces. Galleries in other cities requested shows. She was building something real, something that honored her parents' memory by creating beauty and truth in a world that had shown her so much darkness. Riley's acting career took off around the same time, a role in an off-Broadway production that led to more opportunities. They celebrated together, two friends who'd survived their own versions of transformation, supporting each other through the rebuilding. Marco appeared occasionally, always unexpectedly, always checking that Lena was safe and thriving. He never stayed long, but his presence was a reminder that some connections transcended normal relationships. He'd carried her photograph for 19 years. That kind of dedication created bonds that didn't break just because the mission was complete. You did it, he said during one visit, standing in her small but successful studio. You exposed them, survived them, and built something worthwhile from the wreckage. That's rare. I had help, Lena reminded him. I couldn't have done any of it without you. Maybe. But the courage was yours, the determination was yours. I just provided resources. Marco smiled, and it held genuine warmth. Antonio would have liked you. He believed people could choose to be better than their circumstances. You proved him right. Victor Reyes's trial began a year after his arrest. Lena attended the proceedings, sitting in the public gallery and watching the man who'd murdered her parents face justice at last. He looked smaller in the courtroom, diminished by the weight of evidence and testimony that detailed his decades of crimes. When the guilty verdicts were read, multiple counts of murder, money laundering, racketeering, corruption, Lena felt something release in her chest. The rage she'd carried for so long didn't disappear, but it transformed into something quieter, more manageable. Peace wasn't the right word, but maybe acceptance was. After the sentencing, life in prison without possibility of parole, Lena visited the cemetery where her parents were buried. She'd been there countless times over the years, but this visit felt different. Final, somehow. She knelt by their graves and told them everything. About the photograph, about Marco, about the months spent infiltrating the organization that had killed them, about the evidence she'd gathered and the justice she'd delivered and the price she'd paid to honor their memory. I hope I made you proud, Lena said quietly. I know Dad would probably say I should have gone to the police instead of working with a criminal, but the police failed you, the system failed you, so I did what I had to do. The graves offered no response, of course. Just stone and grass and the silence of loss that never fully healed. But Lena felt heard anyway, felt her parents' presence in the way the autumn wind moved through the cemetery trees. I'm going to be okay, she continued. It took a long time, and it cost more than I knew I had to pay. But I'm building a good life, the kind of life you would have wanted for me. I hope that's enough. She stayed until the sun began setting, painting the cemetery in golden light. Then she stood, touched their names carved into stone, and walked away. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but finally able to carry the memory without being crushed by its weight. 2 years after Reyes's conviction, Lena opened her own gallery in the East Village. It was small but successful, showcasing emerging photographers and providing the kind of support and mentorship she wished she'd had when starting out. Riley helped with the opening, and Marco sent an enormous arrangement of flowers with a card that read simply, "Well done." The gallery became a gathering place for artists and truth seekers, people who believed that images could change minds and expose realities that words couldn't capture. Lena taught workshops on documentary photography, sharing techniques without sharing the specific story that had taught her those skills. She dated occasionally, building connections that sometimes lasted and sometimes didn't. She traveled when she could, capturing images in places that held no memories of violence or loss. She built friendships, supported causes she believed in, lived a life that was rich and complicated and entirely her own. And sometimes, late at night when the gallery was closed and the city was quiet, Lena would pull out the photograph that had started everything. 7-year-old Lena on her swing, smiling in the sunshine, unaware of the darkness approaching. She'd keep it in her office as a reminder, not of what she'd lost, but of what she'd found. The courage to ask questions, the determination to seek truth, the willingness to fight for justice even when the cost was almost unbearable. Her parents had died believing in the possibility of justice. They'd made the hard choice to fight corruption even knowing it might kill them. And their daughter had inherited that courage, that stubborn belief that truth mattered more than safety. The photograph no longer made her sad. Instead, it made her grateful. Grateful for parents who'd shown her what integrity looked like. Grateful for Marco's decades of penance that had protected her. Grateful for Riley's unwavering friendship. Grateful for her own resilience that had carried her through darkness and delivered her to light. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some wounds never fully heal. Some losses remain forever. But some debts get paid. Some truths get told. Some justice, delayed and imperfect as it might be, finally arrives. Lena Carter had spent 19 years not knowing that her parents were murdered. She'd spent months infiltrating the organization that killed them. She'd risked everything to expose the truth and deliver the justice that law enforcement had failed to provide. And now, standing in her own gallery surrounded by images of truth and beauty, she could finally say that the story was complete. Not perfect, not without scars, but complete. Her parents' sacrifice had meaning. Their courage had been honored. Their daughter had transformed grief into purpose and emerged not broken, but stronger for having been tested. That was enough. It had to be enough. And somehow, miraculously, it was.